She vanished without a word 10 years ago. No letter, no call, no reason. He built an entire life trying to forget her. He married someone else. He had a daughter. He buried a wife. He survived things that should have broken him. And then one rainy night on an empty mountain highway, her car broke down right in front of his headlights. Of all the roads in the world, of all the nights, of all the mechanics who could have stopped, he almost kept driving. He really, truly almost did. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like, and stay until the very end. You don't want to miss what happens next. The rain started around 7, the way it always did in Crestfall, Montana. Without warning, without apology. 1 minute the sky was the flat gray of old concrete, and the next it had cracked open and was dumping cold October water onto everything underneath it. The pine trees along Route 9 bent into it. The highway reflectors disappeared under sheets of water. The whole mountain seemed to exhale and pull back into itself, like it was tired of being looked at. Mason Carter noticed none of this. He was behind the wheel of his old Chevy pickup, eyes on the broken center line, Emma asleep in the passenger seat beside him, with her cheek pressed against the window, and a smear of chocolate ice cream dried at the corner of her mouth. They'd stopped at Patty's Creamery after her soccer game. Emma's team had lost 3-1, but she'd scored their only goal, so Mason had declared it a victory and bought her the large cone. She'd eaten half of it and fallen asleep before they even hit the highway. He reached over now and gently adjusted the seatbelt that had slid off her shoulder. She stirred, made a small sound, went still again. He pulled his hand back and watched the road. This was his life. This stretch of highway, this beat-up truck, this kid sleeping beside him. The same 12 miles between the garage and home, driven so many times that his hands turned the wheel on instinct before his brain caught up. He could do it blind. He'd almost done it blind on nights when the exhaustion hit him hard enough that his eyes would blur and he'd have to crack the window and let the cold air slap him awake. 32 years old, and some nights he felt 60. The garage had been brutal that week. 2 engine rebuilds, a transmission replacement, and a tourist's rented SUV that had thrown a rod somewhere on the mountain pass and been towed in looking like it had gone to war. His back ached from the angle he'd held for most of the afternoon. His knuckles were cracked from the cold, the skin around his right thumb split open from where a wrench had slipped. He hadn't eaten anything since the granola bar he'd had at noon. He was tired in the particular way of men who don't let themselves think too much about being tired. The truck's heater clicked and rattled but pushed out warmth. The radio was off. Emma slept better without it, and he'd gotten used to the quiet. Outside, the rain hammered the roof. He passed the old Hendricks farmhouse, dark and shuttered for winter, past the mile marker with the bullet hole in it that had been there since before he moved to Crestfall, past the bend where the road curved toward the ridge, and the guardrail that locals called the prayer rail because of how many near misses had happened there. He was maybe 3 miles from home when he saw the car. It was pulled off onto the gravel shoulder, hazards blinking in the rain. A black Porsche 911, the kind of car that had absolutely no business being on a Montana mountain highway in October. The kind of car Mason recognized the way he recognized all cars, by the shape of it, the posture of it. That was a machine that had been pushed too hard and too far and had finally said enough. He slowed down. He wasn't sure why exactly. Most people drove past breakdowns on a night like this. Called it in, maybe, if they remembered, but he was a mechanic in his bones. Had been since his uncle put a socket wrench in his 12-year-old hand and said, "This is how the world actually works." And there was something in him that physically could not pass a broken car, the same way he couldn't pass a hurt animal on the road without at least stopping to look. He pulled up behind it, leaving his headlights on so they'd be visible from the highway, and cut the engine. "Emma." He touched her shoulder gently. "Hey, bug, wake up for a minute." She stirred, blinked, looked at him with those half-asleep eyes that still sometimes knocked the breath out of him because they were so much her mother's eyes. "Are we home?" "Not yet. I need to check something. You stay in the truck, okay? Lock it after me." "Is someone broken down?" "Looks like." She sat up straighter, suddenly more awake. 8 years old and already curious about everything. "Can I come?" "No, stay here. Lock the door." He grabbed his jacket from behind the seat, an old canvas Carhartt with a broken zipper that he kept meaning to fix, and pulled it on. Then he pushed open the door and stepped out into the rain. It was worse than it looked from inside the truck, cold and driving sideways, the kind that found the gap between your collar and your neck immediately and settled in. He jogged toward the Porsche with his head down, boots splashing through the gravel puddles. He came around to the driver's side and knocked on the window. "Hey, you okay in there?" No answer. He knocked again, louder. The door opened. But she stepped out like she hadn't expected rain either, even though they were both standing in the middle of it. She was wearing a gray wool coat, the expensive kind, and it was already darkening with water across the shoulders. Her hair was dark and loose, and the rain was plastering it against her face. She pushed a strand out of her eyes with the back of her hand. "My engine, it just stopped," she said. "It overheated, I think. The warning light came on, and then—" She stopped. Mason had stopped too. He stopped because he'd looked up from the car and looked at her face, and something had gone sideways in his chest so fast and so hard that for a second he genuinely couldn't locate language. He knew that face. He had known that face for more than 10 years, and spent the last 10 years trying to unknow it. He had buried it under work, under grief, under the routine of a life he'd built specifically to crowd out the space where she used to live. He had not entirely succeeded. "Isabella." Her name came out of him flat, like something falling off a shelf. She went absolutely still. The rain came down between them. The hazard lights blinked, on and off, on and off. "Mason." Her voice was barely above a whisper. They stood there for a moment that had no real length to it. It wasn't long and it wasn't short. It was just a moment that existed outside of normal time, the kind you don't know how to measure after it's over. Then Mason looked back at his truck, at the small silhouette of Emma sitting up in the passenger seat watching them, and something in him clicked back into the practical, into the mechanic, into the father, into the man who got things done because there was no one else around to do them. "Let me look at the engine," he said. His voice came out level. He was proud of that. Isabella Laurent had not survived 10 years at the top of Laurent International by falling apart in difficult situations. She had sat across negotiating tables from men who thought her gender was a weakness and made them regret the assumption. She had fired a CFO the week before Christmas because he was cooking the books, then walked into the board meeting 20 minutes later and presented fourth quarter earnings without her voice shaking once. She had managed her father's slow death from a stroke while simultaneously navigating a hostile acquisition that threatened to dismantle everything her family had built. She did not fall apart. But standing in the rain on the shoulder of a Montana highway, watching Mason Carter circle the front of her car with a flashlight he'd pulled from his jacket pocket, she felt something in her chest go quietly to pieces. He was different and he wasn't. Taller somehow, though that wasn't possible. Or maybe just more solid, his shoulders broader, his jaw carrying a week's worth of stubble that hadn't been there when she last saw him. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't existed before. His hands, as he propped open the hood and leaned in, were a working man's hands. Scarred, capable. He had always been capable. That was the thing that had undone her completely when she was 20, standing in her father's office being told in very calm and specific language exactly what her feelings for Mason Carter were going to cost her family. "He would be fine without you," her father had said. "Men like him are built for hard things. Men like him." As if Mason was a type, as if he could be filed and categorized and dismissed. She had hated her father for saying it. She had also, in the worst moments, wondered if he was right. "Coolant lines cracked," Mason said from under the hood. His voice was muffled. "You've been running dry. Surprised it held this long, honestly. Can you fix it?" "Not out here, not tonight. But I can get it stable enough that it's not going to crack anything else. I've got coolant in the truck." He straightened up and looked at her over the hood. His face was neutral in the way that isn't neutral at all, the kind of neutral that takes effort. "You have roadside assistance?" "I do. I'll call. Cell signal's garbage on this stretch until you get around the ridge, another mile and a half." He was already walking back toward his truck. Isabella watched him go. Watched the way he moved. Purposeful, no wasted motion. She remembered that about him. He was never someone who stood still and deliberated when there was something that needed doing. She looked up the road and then down it. Nothing in either direction but rain and darkness and the white noise of water on pavement. Then she looked back at the truck and saw a small face watching her from the passenger window. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, with her chin resting on the window ledge and her eyes wide with frank curiosity. Isabella lifted one hand in a small wave. The girl waved back immediately, then grinned, a big, gap-toothed grin that appeared and disappeared like a flashbulb. Mason came back with a 2-gallon container of coolant and a headlamp he'd strapped on, and got back to work without saying anything. Isabella stood beside him because there was nowhere else to stand, and because leaving felt somehow worse than staying. "You have a daughter," she said. "Yeah. She's beautiful." He didn't answer that. She watched his hands work. "Mason, I didn't know you were in Crestfall." "Why would you?" The question landed without inflection, but she felt the weight of it anyway. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." He tightened something, checked the line, looked at the readout on the cap. "You on your way through, or did you stop here for something?" "Driving to Whitefish. I have a meeting in the morning. I didn't want to fly. I needed the drive." She paused. "I like driving. You always did." He said it before he could stop himself, and she heard the slight catch that came after it, the almost imperceptible flinch. "She should hold now. Don't push it. Find a garage in Whitefish first thing in the morning. Get the line properly replaced. You push it again in the cold and you'll crack the block." "Okay?" "Keep the heat off. Heater pulls from the coolant system." "Okay." He lowered the hood and latched it. Stepped back. The rain was lighter now, just slightly, the way mountain rain sometimes would back off for a few minutes before coming back harder. They were standing a foot apart, close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the beam of his headlamp, that same dark slate gray that she had thought about more times than she would ever admit to anyone, close enough that she could see he was not looking directly at her. "Mason." Her voice came out different this time, smaller. "I know you have no reason to— Diner's a mile ahead," he said. "Hot coffee and food. Emma needs to eat something and it's too late to cook at home." He looked at her for 1 second, quick and direct, before looking away. "If you want somewhere to wait while you make your calls." It was not an invitation. Not exactly. It was a mechanic telling a stranded driver where the nearest services were. But it was also something else, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. "Thank you," Isabella said quietly. He nodded once, already turning toward the truck. Patsy's Road Stop was exactly what its name advertised. A low-slung building off the highway with neon in the windows and gravel in the lot and a hand-painted sign that had been there since the 1970s and showed no signs of being replaced. Inside it smelled like coffee and bacon grease and the particular warmth of a place that stays heated all winter because the customers need it to. There were 4 tables, a counter with stools, a jukebox in the corner that Patsy Kowalski had owned for 30 years and would not allow anyone to update under any circumstances. They were the only customers. Patsy herself was behind the counter, a stout woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head and the general demeanor of someone who had heard it all twice already and found most of it tolerable. She looked up when they came in, took in Mason, Emma, and then Isabella in the expensive coat with rain-plastered hair, and her expression remained perfectly settled, like none of this was any of her business. "Hey, Mason." "Hey, Bugaboo." She leaned over the counter toward Emma. "Your team win today?" "Lost 3-1, Emma reported, climbing onto a stool at the counter. "But I scored." "Course you did." Patsy put a cup of hot cocoa in front of her without being asked. Then she looked at Isabella. "Coffee?" "Please." "Yes, thank you." "Sit anywhere." Mason took the booth by the window where he could see the parking lot. Emma had watched him do this her entire life, always positioning himself near exits, near visibility, the habit of a man who'd spent years being the only adult responsible for a child's safety. She'd asked him once why he always sat that way, and he told her it was so he could keep an eye on the truck. She'd accepted that, being 7. Emma abandoned her cocoa after 2 sips to go examine the jukebox selections with the intensity of a small scholar. Mason wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and watched her go. Across the table, Isabella sat down. They had not looked directly at each other for more than 2 seconds since the parking lot. That was a fact they were both aware of without discussing. "I didn't know about your wife," Isabella said, finally. The sentence dropped into the quiet. Mason looked at the table, turned his coffee mug in his hands, left, right, left. Something he did when he was processing. Isabella remembered that too, though she wished she didn't. It felt wrong that she still had so much of him memorized. "It was 3 years ago," he said. "Breast cancer. They caught it late." A pause. "Her name was Claire. She was a good person. She was a really good person." "I'm sorry." "You don't have to be sorry. You didn't know her." "I'm sorry for Emma." He looked up at that. Something shifted in his face. Not quite pain, more like the thing that lives just behind pain, in the small hours when the lights are off. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, that's the one." Emma had pressed her nose against the jukebox glass and was pointing at something, trying to get Patsy's attention. Patsy was already walking toward it with a quarter in her hand. "She looks like you," Isabella said. "She looks like Claire." He said it without accusation, just as fact. "Around the eyes. Same stubborn chin." A corner of his mouth moved, the ghost of something. "Same stubbornness." "She seems wonderful." "She is. She's the best thing I've ever done." He paused. "Only good thing I did right on the first try." The jukebox clicked and something old and slow began playing. Something with pedal steel and a woman's voice. And Emma came running back to the table because she'd spent her quarter and now needed to report what she'd done. "I picked a song," she announced, sliding into the booth beside Mason. She looked across at Isabella with the forthright assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking at someone. "Your coat is really pretty. It's wet, though." "I know," Isabella said. "I got caught in the rain." "We caught you," Emma corrected. "Dad stopped for you." She looked at Mason for confirmation, as if this were a point worth making clearly. "He always stops." "Emma," Mason said. "He does," Emma said, unapologetic, turning back to Isabella. "He stopped for Mrs. Halverson when her battery died in February, and he stopped for the tourist guy with the trailer, and he stopped for the dog that got loose on the highway, but that one I helped with." She thought for a moment. "Are you from here?" "No, I'm from San Francisco. I'm just driving through." "Dad's from Montana." "Well, he's from Billings, but that's still Montana." Emma picked up her cocoa. "What do you do?" "Emma." Mason's voice carried a note of warning now. "I'm just asking." "It's all right," Isabella said. She looked at the girl, the direct, watchful, completely unguarded eyes of her, and felt something pull in her chest. "I run a company. A big one. I make sure it all keeps working." Emma nodded seriously. "Like Dad keeps cars working?" "Something like that, yes." Emma seemed satisfied with this. She turned her attention to her cocoa. Mason was looking at Isabella. She could feel it before she looked up and confirmed it. That particular quality of being seen by someone who knew you before you were whoever you'd become. She held his gaze for a moment, just one moment. "We need to talk," she said, low enough that Emma, now occupied with the cocoa, wouldn't catch it. Mason looked back at the table, at his coffee, at his hands. "Yeah," he said. "I figured we probably did." Patsy brought them both pie without being asked. Apple for Mason, which was what he always had. And then she just put a second slice in front of Isabella because she'd looked like she needed it. Nobody argued. Emma ate half a grilled cheese and then fell asleep against Mason's shoulder like a switch had been flipped. One arm hooked around his, and her face tipped to the side and her breathing going slow and easy. Mason shifted his arm so she wouldn't fall and kept her tucked against him. And he stayed very still the way parents learn to stay still when a sleeping child is on them. He looked over Emma's head at Isabella. "Tell me," he said. She had been holding it for 10 years. She had rehearsed versions of this conversation in her car, in hotels, in the elevator of her office building, anywhere she was alone long enough for her mind to go somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. She'd imagined it 100 different ways. Confrontational, tender, formal, accidental. She'd imagined Mason angry. She'd imagined him cold. She'd imagined, in the more honest and sleepless versions, that he wouldn't want to hear it at all. She had not imagined him sitting in a diner with his daughter asleep on his arm, watching her with eyes that were careful and tired and not quite as closed as he wanted them to be. She started at the beginning. "Mas, I was 20 years old," she said. "My mother was sick. Not just sick. The doctors were saying she had maybe 18 months. My father was... You remember what he was like." Mason said nothing. His eyes didn't move from her face. "He sat me down." He told me that he was restructuring the family trusts. He said that any money that would go toward my mother's care, toward the treatment in Switzerland that they were recommending, the experimental protocol. She stopped. Her voice had developed a texture. She smoothed it out. He said that funding was contingent on certain family decisions. His word, decisions. Like you and me, Mason said. He'd had you investigated. She watched Mason's jaw tighten. He knew everything. Where you worked, where you grew up. He had the whole story. He called you... She stopped. Say it. He called you a romantic entanglement that would destabilize my focus during a critical period of the company's development. The words were so clinical, so precisely memorized. He said you would hold me back, that someone like you... Her voice faltered. He was very specific about what he meant by that. The muscle in Mason's jaw moved again. Yeah, I can imagine. I was 20 years old and my mother was dying, Isabella said, and I didn't have the money myself. The trusts were in his control. The treatment was $300,000, and I was still in school, and I had nothing that was mine. The rain had picked back up outside. It ran down the diner windows in long, wavering lines. So you left. So I left. The two words settled over the table. Emma shifted slightly in her sleep. Mason waited. I told myself I would fix it, Isabella said, that it was temporary, that I would find another way. I would build my own money, my own independence, and then I would... She stopped herself, looked at her hands. But then by the time I had the money, by the time my father's control of anything I cared about was truly gone, you were with someone else. You'd moved on, and you seemed... Her voice softened. You seemed okay. I could see it. You seemed like you were building something real. I was. Mason looked at Emma's sleeping face. I was. I know. So you stayed away because I seemed okay. I stayed away because I'd already taken enough from you. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the song on the jukebox ended and the next one started, and Patsy refilled his coffee without him asking. My mother lived, Isabella said quietly. The treatment worked. She lived another 7 years. She died 4 years ago, peacefully. A beat. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I don't know either, Mason said. Honestly. I tried to find you. Once, when I decided I was going to... She shook her head. I found out you'd gotten married. I saw a picture online, someone's wedding post, you and her. She looked at the window. She was lovely. You looked happy. I was. He said it without qualification. I was happy, Isabella. Claire was... She was a real person. Real in a way I needed. He paused. She wasn't you, but I didn't need her to be. I needed her to be her. Isabella nodded slowly. She understood that in a way that hurt cleanly, like a paper cut, the kind that stings precisely because it's so small. And then she died, Isabella said. And then she died. The words just sat there between them, naked and without cushion. Emma was 5, Mason said. She asked me once, about 6 months after, if Mommy was coming back. I didn't handle it well. I told her the truth, but I told it badly, and I scared her, and she didn't ask again for almost a year. His voice was even, but it cost him. I still think about that. The way I said it, the look on her face. He exhaled slowly. I've made a lot of mistakes as a father, but that one I carry. You're clearly a wonderful father. I'm a good enough father. Good enough is what I've got. He looked across the table. I don't know what to do with what you're telling me. You don't have to do anything. Then why are you telling me? Because I've been carrying it for 10 years. Her voice steadied. Because I owe you the truth, even if it doesn't change anything. Because I spent 10 years building the life my father insisted on, and not once did it feel like what I actually wanted. She looked at him, direct, finally. And because I saw your headlights behind my car tonight, and I thought, if there's any chance in the world that we get to have a conversation, I am not going to waste it the way I wasted everything else. Mason looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Emma. Then he looked at the window, at the rain. I'm going to need some time, he said, to sit with this. I know. I don't know what I feel right now. I thought I'd buried most of it. I thought... He exhaled. I don't know what I thought. That's fair. Are you still going to Whitefish? Tomorrow morning, I have a meeting. You should get the line replaced first thing. Tell them it's the 911 and the coolant line cracked on the left side. They'll know what they're looking at. She almost smiled. You're giving me car advice. You need car advice. I do. Emma stirred against his arm, made a small sound of protest, and settled back down. Mason looked at her with the practiced tenderness of someone who had been watching a child sleep for 8 years and still hadn't gotten used to it. She asked me once, he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost as if he was talking to himself. Why we never have people over, family people, people who stay. He paused. I didn't have a good answer. Isabella said nothing. She just listened. I told her that some things take time, he said. She asked me how much time. I told her I didn't know. He looked up. I still don't. That's honest? It's the only thing I've got. Outside, the rain fell and fell. Inside, the jukebox played something quiet and without hurry. Patsy wiped down the counter at the far end and very deliberately did not look in their direction, in the particular way of people who know when not to watch. Emma slept on, her breath even and untroubled, her small hand curled around the edge of Mason's jacket. And two people who had loved each other once and lost each other badly sat in a warm, ordinary room and tried to figure out what anything meant. He paid for everything, which made Isabella reach for her wallet, and him shake his head once without looking at her. I've got it. She didn't argue. Some instinct told her that arguing about this, tonight, with this man, would be exactly the wrong move. She helped carry Emma to the truck. The girl was completely under, soft and heavy in the way sleeping children are, and she didn't wake when Mason buckled her back in. Isabella stood by the passenger door and watched him do it, watched the care in his hands, the automatic competence of it, the way he tucked the seatbelt so it wouldn't cut into her neck. Her signal's good now, Mason said, turning back. You should be able to get a call out. Thank you for stopping and for... She gestured vaguely toward the diner. For listening. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at her. The rain was down to a mist now, soft and gray, more of a mood than a weather condition. It made the parking lot lights bloom and smear. I'm not going to pretend tonight was easy, he said, because it wasn't. I know. But He stopped, started again. I'm glad you're okay. Out there, on the road. I'm glad I stopped. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to whatever forgiveness would sound like in a context this complicated. But it was real, and she recognized it as such. Me too, she said. He nodded once, got in the truck, started the engine. Isabella stood in this parking lot and watched the Chevy's taillights disappear around the curve of Route 9, and then she stood there a little longer, even after the lights were gone, in the quiet mist and the smell of rain on pine, holding her phone without dialing anything. Then she walked back to her car, which started on the first try, and she sat in it for a long time in the glow of the dash. She thought about a 20-year-old girl standing in her father's office. She thought about a decision that had taken 3 minutes to make and 10 years to live inside. She pulled out of the lot and started north toward Whitefish, the road dark and quiet ahead of her, the mountains invisible above her in the clouds. Back on Route 9, Mason drove the last 3 miles home in silence. Emma slept. The heater rattled. The wipers swept back and forth in their steady rhythm. He thought about Claire, the way he often did at night, not with the acute grief of the first year, or the dull, constant ache of the second, but with the quiet and specific tenderness of someone remembering a real person. The way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished them. The way she'd leave half-finished cups of tea all over the house. The way she'd looked at Emma with this stunned wonder, even after years, as if she still couldn't believe they'd made something so completely themselves. He thought about what Isabella had told him. He rolled it around carefully, the way you handle something you're not sure is stable. He thought about a 20-year-old kid, which was what he'd been, working at his uncle's garage in Billings, falling for a girl who was so far outside his usual orbit that his friends had teased him about it. He thought about the way she'd felt like the most honest thing in his life up until the point where she disappeared. He pulled into his driveway, cut the engine, sat for a moment. Daddy? Emma, groggy, lifting her head, still half in a dream somewhere. We're home, Bug. She blinked, looked at the dark house. The lady from the road. Was she okay? Mason looked at his daughter's sleepy face. "Yeah," he said. "She was okay." Emma nodded, satisfied, and went loose again against the seatbelt. Mason got out of the truck and went around to her side and carried her in, her head on his shoulder and her arms hanging loose through the dark living room and down the hallway and into her bed, where he pulled the blanket up and she turned onto her side without waking. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. In the kitchen, there was half a pot of old coffee and the dishes from yesterday morning that he still hadn't gotten to. On the table, Emma's homework, half finished. On the counter, a birthday card from his mother that had arrived 2 days late because she always forgot the mailing time from Billings. His life. Ordinary and real and full of the small failures and adjustments of someone getting through. He went to the kitchen, looked at the coffee, decided against it, looked out the window at the rain. He stood there for a long time. He didn't know what he was going to do. He genuinely didn't know. There was no clarity, no obvious answer, just a feeling that sat in his chest like a held breath, the feeling of something that hadn't resolved yet, something that was still moving. He turned off the kitchen light. He walked down the hall. He lay down in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain on the roof until, somewhere in the middle of it, he stopped hearing it. And somewhere in Crestfall, in a hotel room with a view of the mountains she couldn't see in the dark, Isabella Laurent sat on the edge of a bed and held her phone and thought about a man with a broken heater and a sleeping daughter and eyes that were exactly as careful and exactly as tired as she deserved them to be. She didn't call anyone. She just sat there, waiting for morning in a way she hadn't waited for anything in a very long time. The garage opened at 7:30, which meant Mason was there at 7, which was how it always worked. He'd slept maybe 4 hours. Not terrible for him. There had been stretches in the first year after Claire died when 4 hours felt like a luxury. But he was aware of the deficit in a specific low-grade way, a slight heaviness behind the eyes and a patience that had been trimmed at the edges. He'd made Emma's lunch, gotten her dressed, driven her to school, had a brief argument about whether she needed her winter jacket yet. She said no. He said yes. She wore it unzipped, and then driven the 6 miles to Carter's mountain garage, with his second cup of coffee going cold in the cup holder. He pulled up the bay doors, turned on the overhead lights, looked at the work orders pinned to the board. The transmission job from yesterday was almost done. The tourist SUV was waiting on a part. There was a brake job scheduled for 9. A woman named Kowalski, unrelated to Patsy, who drove a 2019 Subaru she'd never once had serviced on schedule, and who Mason fully expected to find additional problems with. He put on his coveralls and got to work. The thing about physical labor, about the particular kind of work that kept your hands occupied and your eyes focused and your body committed to a task, was that it didn't stop your brain. Some people believed it did, that working with your hands was a kind of meditation, a clearing. Mason had found the opposite to be true. When his hands had something to do, his mind went wherever it wanted, and there was nothing to stop it. By 8:15, he had thought about Isabella no fewer than a dozen times without meaning to. He thought about the look on her face when she first stepped out of the car, the way she'd gone completely still when she recognized him. He'd watched a lot of faces in his life, learned to read them the way his uncle had taught him to read engines, by sound, by hesitation, by what didn't move when it should. Isabella's face, in that moment, had been telling the truth. He knew it then, and he knew it now. Whatever she'd expected from that drive to Whitefish, it wasn't him. He thought about what she'd told him in the diner. He'd rolled it over again in the night, examining it from different angles, the way you turn something in a light to check for cracks. The story held. He hated that it held. It would have been easier, in a mean and specific way, if it hadn't. If he could have found the self-serving part, the place where she'd simplified her own guilt into a version that let her off the hook. He'd looked for it. He was good at that, had gotten good at it in the years since her, the way people get good at things they practice in the dark. But the story held. A sick mother, a controlling father, a 20-year-old girl with no money of her own, and 300,000 reasons to do exactly what she'd done. He understood it. He didn't know if understanding it meant anything yet, but he understood it. His phone buzzed on the workbench. He looked at it without picking it up, then picked it up. A number he didn't recognize. San Francisco area code. He stood there with the phone in his hand for 2 rings. Then he answered. Carter's mountain garage. A pause. Then, you answer your personal phone like it's the garage? Same number, he said. Save money. Of course it is. Isabella's voice was different in the morning, slightly lower, like it hadn't fully warmed up yet. He recognized that too, and wished he didn't. I wanted to let you know I found a garage in Whitefish. They said they can look at it at 10. Good. Tell them to check the other coolant hoses while they're in there. On a car that age, if one's going, the others probably aren't far behind. I'll tell them. A pause. How are you? He set down the wrench he was holding, picked up his coffee. The wrong order of operations, but he did it anyway. I'm at work. Right, sorry, She stopped. I didn't want to leave without saying something. It felt strange to just drive away. You already said something, last night. I know. Another pause, and he could hear something in it, a kind of gathering. I know that wasn't easy, any of it, and I know you said you needed time, and I'm not trying to push anything. I just wanted you to know that last night mattered to me, that it wasn't... She seemed to search for the word. It wasn't nothing. Mason looked out the open bay door at the empty morning road. A thin coat of frost on the gravel. The mountains showing their tops above the tree line in the clear air that comes after heavy rain. No, he said. It wasn't nothing. He heard her exhale, small and barely audible. I'm in Whitefish through tomorrow afternoon, she said. If you wanted to, I don't know. Talk more or not. I understand if not. He didn't answer right away. The transmission job waited. The brake appointment was in less than an hour. I'll think about it, he said. Okay. Get the hoses checked. I will. And then quietly, before she hung up, thank you, Mason, for last night, for stopping. The line went clear. Mason stood with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket and picked up the wrench and got back under the truck. His brain kept right on going where it wanted to go. He let it. The work got done anyway. Emma found out the way Emma found out most things, by asking directly and not stopping until she got an answer. She asked at dinner, 2 nights later, while they were eating the spaghetti that Mason made every Wednesday, because it was the easiest thing he knew how to make in bulk, and it covered lunch the next day. She'd been quieter than usual since getting home from school, which Mason had noticed and attributed to something that happened at recess. And then she looked up from her plate and said, "Is the lady from the diner your friend?" Mason twisted pasta around his fork. Why? Because you've been weird since we saw her. I haven't been weird. You burned the garlic bread. He looked at the slightly blackened bread in the center of the table, which he had burned and then scraped and served anyway because scraping it was fine and waste was waste. That was a separate thing. You never burned the garlic bread. Emma, I'm just saying. She poked at her spaghetti. She was nice, the lady. She waved at me. I know, I was there. What's her name? Mason set down his fork. He looked at his daughter across the table. 8 years old, gap-toothed, perceptive in the way that made strangers ask if she was older, the way that had made Claire laugh and say she gets it from neither of us. She just arrived like this. Isabella, he said. Emma tried the name out, quietly, like she was testing the weight of it. Did you know her before? A long time ago, yeah. Like a friend? Yeah, like a friend. Emma looked at him. The way she looked at him when she thought he was being technically accurate but not really truthful, which was a look she had perfected at approximately age 6. Okay, she said, and went back to her spaghetti. They ate the rest of dinner without talking about it. Mason washed the dishes. Emma did her homework at the table, occasionally asking him to spell things and occasionally spelling them wrong on purpose to see if he was paying attention. He was always paying attention. She'd figured that out around age 7 and now did it as a kind of game. Later, when she was in bed and he was standing in the hallway outside her door, he heard her say, "Dad?" "Yeah." "You should call her back." He put his hand on the door frame. "Go to sleep, Emma." "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." She looked lonely, the lady. Nice people shouldn't be lonely. He stood in the hallway a moment longer than he needed to. Then he said, "Good night, Bug." "Night, Dad." He walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water he didn't drink, stood at the counter for a while. Then he picked up his phone, looked at the San Francisco number, put it back down. Then picked it up again and dialed before he could argue himself out of it. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been awake. "Hi," she said. "Hi." A beat. Not uncomfortable exactly. More like two people adjusting to a frequency. "I told Emma your name," he said. "She wanted to know." "What did she say?" "She said you looked lonely, and nice people shouldn't be lonely." He paused. "She's 8. She says things like that." "She's wonderful," Isabella said. "She really is, Mason." "Yeah, I know." There was a sound on her end, a window, maybe, traffic somewhere far below. San Francisco sounds. "Are you back?" "Got back this afternoon." "Meeting went fine." She paused. "Well, it went. Fine might be optimistic. There were complications." "What kind?" "The kind that don't resolve in a morning." She sighed, and it was a real sigh, not a performed one. "I have a board situation. There's a faction that's been quietly building a case that I'm—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear about this." I asked. "You were being polite." "I don't ask things to be polite." Another pause. He could almost feel her recalibrating. He'd forgotten that about her. Or maybe he hadn't forgotten it, just set it aside. The way she would do that. The way she would check herself against what she expected of people and find it didn't always match. "There are people on my board who think a 30-year-old woman who inherited a company from her father is a temporary situation," she said. "They've been patient for 2 years. I don't think they're patient anymore." "What are they trying to do?" "Force a vote on a restructuring that would give the board more operational control, effectively removing my authority to make unilateral decisions about the company's direction." Her voice was calm, but the kind of calm that takes practice. It's a politely packaged power transfer. "Can they do it?" "Not if I have the votes." "Currently I have the votes. The question is whether I still have them in 2 weeks when the meeting happens." A pause. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this." "Because you're the same person who always needed to say things out loud to figure out if they were real," he said, and then felt the intimacy of having said it and couldn't take it back. The silence on the line had a texture to it now. "You remember that?" she said quietly. "I remember a lot of things." He said it without softening it. It was true, and she deserved the truth. "Doesn't mean I know what to do with them yet." "I know. But He stopped, decided. "I'd like to keep talking, if that's something you want, not because I have it figured out, just because I don't think last night should be the end of it." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was a shade more careful, the way you are when something matters and you don't want to handle it wrong. "I'd like that too," she said. What followed was not a romance. Not at first, and not in any clean or movie-like way. What it was, for the first several weeks, was phone calls. Late ones, mostly. After Emma was in bed, after Mason had showered off the garage smell and was sitting at the kitchen table with a beer he was only partially drinking. Isabella in her San Francisco apartment, which Mason gathered was very high up and had a lot of glass because he could always hear the city behind her in a muted, distant way. They talked about small things, about work, hers complicated and corporate, his straightforward in the way that all complicated things are when you strip them to their purpose. He told her about the SUV that had come back with new problems. She told him about a vendor meeting that had run 4 hours and accomplished nothing. He told her about Emma's soccer tournament. She told him about her board meeting, which she had survived by 3 votes, and an uncomfortable conversation with a man named Terrence Albrecht, who she described as looking like someone had pressed a penguin into a suit. Mason had laughed at that. He hadn't expected to laugh. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. He also wasn't sure what to do with the fact that by the 3rd week, he was looking forward to these calls in a way he recognized but hadn't felt in years. Not since Claire, and before Claire. Not since Isabella herself, and the circularity of that was not lost on him. He wasn't a man who went around missing things, as a rule. He had always operated better in the present tense, in what was in front of him, what needed doing, what could actually be fixed. But somewhere in the 11 o'clock quiet of his kitchen, with Emma asleep and the house settled around him and Isabella's voice on the phone, he was becoming aware of how long he'd been operating only in the present tense. how he'd gotten good at cutting off the past and stopped wondering about the future because wondering felt like asking for things he wasn't sure he was allowed to want. He called his friend Gabe about it, which was not a thing he did easily. Gabe Ruiz had worked 2 bays over from Mason for 6 years and was the closest thing Mason had to a best friend, in the way of men who are friends through proximity and shared work and never talk about being friends at all. Gabe was 42, divorced twice, and had opinions about everything, which Mason found alternately useful and exhausting. He told Gabe the basic version, which meant he left out the history and the emotion and gave him mostly the facts. Woman from his past, reconnected, talking on the phone. Gabe listened to this while eating his lunch, like a gas station burrito of questionable vintage, and then said, "Is she coming here? I don't know. Does she want to? I don't know. Have you asked her?" Mason had not asked her. He hadn't entirely admitted to himself, until Gabe said it that plainly, that he wanted to be asked. "You're overthinking it," Gabe said. "You always overthink. You overthought that Subaru for 2 days, and then it turned out to be exactly what I told you it was on day 1. That's not the same thing. It's the exact same thing. You have a process, and then you get in the way of your own process." Gabe balled up the burrito wrapper. "She called you first?" "Yeah. She drove past her exit to tell you she wanted to keep talking?" "Not literally. We talked on the phone." "I'm speaking spiritually, Mason." Gabe looked at him with the long-suffering patience of someone who has had this kind of conversation too many times. "She made the first move. The next one's yours." "I don't know that I'm ready for there to be a move." "Moves don't wait for ready. That's the whole thing about moves." Mason told him that was not helpful. Gabe told him to stop burning garlic bread and think about it. Mason had not told Gabe about the garlic bread. He said so. Gabe said Emma had mentioned it at the school pickup line and people were concerned. This was the problem with small towns. He asked her, on a Thursday night in November, whether she'd ever thought about coming back to Montana. It wasn't a leading question. It was a real one. He genuinely wasn't sure of the answer, which was why he asked it. There was a pause on her end, longer than the usual beat. "I've thought about it," she said. "I think about a lot of things I don't do." "What stopped you?" "You mean besides the obvious?" Yeah, besides that." She was quiet a moment. "I never felt like I had the right to just show up in a place, in someone's life, after what I did." She paused. "There's a version of coming back that's selfish. That's for me and not for anyone else. I spent a long time being unsure which version mine was. And now? Now I had a cracked coolant line and no cell service, and your headlights were behind my car, and I didn't get to decide," she said, which maybe was the only way it was ever going to happen. Mason thought about that for a moment, about all the things that had to line up for those headlights to be there. He had almost not stopped. He had, in a genuine and literal way, almost kept driving. "Emma has a tournament in Whitefish," he said. "First weekend in December. I drive up with her every year. We stay overnight. She plays 3 games in one day and eats too much and falls asleep in the truck on the way home." He stopped. "I was going to ask if you wanted to be there. I'm not saying that to be something it isn't. I just thought..." "Yes," Isabella said. Immediately, before he finished, he paused. "I haven't finished explaining." "I know, yes." He sat with that for a moment. Then, Okay, and she said. And the call went on and they talked about other things, and Mason didn't mention it again that night, but when he went to bed he lay there looking at the ceiling and something in his chest felt different than it had in a while. Not resolved, not simple, just different. A different quality of not knowing, more like standing at the beginning of something instead of just standing still. He fell asleep faster than usual. Isabella told Diane about it the next morning. Diane Park was her executive assistant, had been for 4 years, knew her schedule better than she knew it herself, and was the only person in Isabella's professional life who sometimes also functioned as a mirror. She was 35 and efficient and had the particular gift of saying exactly what she thought without it sounding unkind. Isabella told her she was going to Whitefish in early December for a personal matter and needed the weekend blocked. Diane looked at the calendar. Then at Isabella. "The Laurent Industries retreat is that Sunday." "I know. I'll be back for the Monday meeting." You're supposed to open the retreat Saturday evening. The COO can open it. He's been wanting a longer platform anyway. Let him have it. Diane typed something, then looked up. Is this about the mechanic from Montana? Isabella stared at her. How do you know about that? You've been on the phone at 11 o'clock at night for 3 weeks, and you've been in a marginally better mood on the mornings after, Diane said, without looking up from her screen. I have worked for you for 4 years. I notice things. You notice things that are none of your business. You pay me to notice things. Diane finished typing. Weekend is blocked. I've moved the retreat opening to Marcus. He'll be insufferable about it for a week, but that's survivable. She looked up. Is this a good idea? Isabella considered lying and then decided against it. I have no idea. But you're going. But I'm going. Diane nodded, once, the way she nodded when she had an opinion she had decided not to express. Isabella had learned to read these nods over 4 years. This one was the I think this is either very brave or very foolish, and we'll see which nod. I'll have the car serviced, Diane said, and went back to work. The weekend of the tournament was cold in the clean, hard way of early Montana December, the sky a bright, flattened blue with no weather in it. Isabella drove up Friday afternoon and checked into a hotel on the main street in Whitefish that was neither the fanciest place in town nor the most modest, which had taken some thought. She had learned, in ways she was still cataloging, that certain instincts needed to be recalibrated around Mason, around his life, around what fit. She didn't call him when she arrived. She'd said she would text, and she texted. His response came 12 minutes later. Emma knows you're coming. She requested we pick you up for dinner. Fair warning, she's going to talk a lot. Isabella sat on the edge of the hotel bed and read that twice. Emma knows you're coming. A child had been told she was coming. A real, specific, small human who had no frame for this situation and would look at it with complete, uncomplicated openness, the way children looked at everything. And Isabella felt something she wasn't entirely used to feeling, which was terrified in a way that had nothing to do with boardrooms or votes. She texted back, "Tell her I'll try to keep up." His response was a single laughing emoji, which felt significant for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. She got up, unpacked, looked at the mountains out the window for a while. The sun was dropping behind them, going orange at the edges. She thought about the diner on Route 9, about the rain on the windows and Emma asleep, and the jukebox playing something low, and the look on Mason's face when she'd finally said the thing she'd been holding for 10 years. I never stopped loving you. She'd said it. In a roadside diner in the rain with an 8-year-old nearby, she had said it. Looking back on it, she was not sure she had planned to. It had just come out of her the way truths sometimes did, without waiting for the right moment, without asking permission. He hadn't said it back. She hadn't expected him to. She didn't know, honestly, if he would ever say it back, or if he still felt anything that could be called that word, or if what they were building right now was something that would even lead anywhere recognizable. She had spent 2 years telling herself she didn't need the resolution she actually needed, and she was not going to do that again. She was not going to decide in advance what this was. She was just going to have dinner with a mechanic she had once planned to marry and his 8-year-old daughter who talked a lot. When the knock came at her hotel door at 6:15, she was ready, or close enough. She opened the door to find Emma standing in the hallway with her jacket unzipped. Mason was behind her, one hand lifted toward the collar of it in the universal gesture of a parent who had already lost this argument multiple times. And Emma looked up at her with those wide, watchful eyes and said, without preamble, "You're tall." "I am," Isabella agreed. "Dad said you were pretty. He didn't say tall." Emma considered this with the seriousness of a scientist noting an unexpected variable. Then she looked at Mason. "You left out tall." Mason looked at the ceiling. "I didn't say she was pretty. I said I knew her." "You did say pretty. You said she's..." And then you stopped and said I knew her. But there was definitely a pretty before the stop. Isabella pressed her lips together very firmly. Mason looked at her for the first time since she'd opened the door. His face was doing the complicated thing it had been doing since the rain-soaked shoulder of Route 9, carrying several things at once without resolving any of them. But there was something underneath it tonight, something she hadn't seen clearly before, something that wasn't quite ready to be named but wasn't hiding either. Hi, he said. Hi, she said. Emma pulled her coat shut by the lapels, apparently deciding on her own terms. Can we get pizza? Dad said it was up to me and I want pizza. Pizza's perfect, Isabella said. Good. Emma headed for the elevator. Come on, I'm going to tell you about the tournament. I've been practicing my corner kicks. Mason and Isabella fell into step behind her down the hall, and Isabella heard him exhale beside her. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. The sound of a man who had gotten used to being surprised by his own life. She understood that feeling. She was starting to understand it more every day. The elevator doors opened. Emma marched in. They followed. The doors closed on the three of them, and the lobby fell out of view, and somewhere outside the clean Montana cold settled in around the lit-up streets of a small town, and nobody said anything, and nobody needed to. Emma scored twice in the first game. Mason stood on the sideline in the cold with his hands shoved into his jacket pockets and watched her tear up the left side of the field with the focused, slightly reckless energy of a kid who had no concept of pacing and didn't need one yet. She went for the ball the way she went for most things, directly, without hesitation, as if the possibility of not getting there simply hadn't occurred to her. When the second goal went in, she turned around looking for Mason, and he raised both arms and she grinned the gap-toothed grin and immediately turned back to the game, satisfied. Isabella was standing 2 feet to his left. She'd shown up at the field in jeans and a heavy parka she must have bought specifically for this trip because it still had the stiffness of something unworn, and she was holding a coffee from the concession stand that had gone cold 20 minutes ago because she kept forgetting to drink it. She watched Emma the way she watched most things, with complete attention, missing nothing. She's fast, Isabella said. She gets that from Claire. Mason kept his eyes on the field. Claire ran track in college. Emma's got her stride. That low center of gravity. Isabella nodded. She'd learned in the past 18 hours that the right response to Mason talking about Claire was not to fill the silence after it. He wasn't looking for a response. He was just keeping her present, keeping her real. It had taken Isabella a couple of false starts to understand that this wasn't something she needed to navigate around. It was just who he was. Does she know about the scholarship? Isabella asked. Mason glanced at her. She's 8. I know. I mean, has it occurred to you, watching her, that she could be very good? He was quiet a moment, watching Emma fight through a double-team midfield with the sheer determination of someone who hadn't heard of the word impossible. It's occurred to me, he said carefully. I don't think about it too hard. The things you start hoping for get heavy fast. That's a very controlled way to be a parent. That's the only way I know how to be one. The whistle blew for halftime. Emma came running over at full speed, which was the only speed she operated at, and crashed into Mason's side with enough force to move him half a step. He caught her automatically, steadied her, put a hand on the top of her head. Did you see the second one? She demanded. I cut inside like Gabe showed me. I saw. It worked. She looked up at Isabella with the frank assessment she'd been applying since the elevator. Did you see? Both goals, Isabella said. You were faster than everyone else on the field. Emma considered this with the seriousness of someone filing away relevant data. I'm not faster than Lily Tran, but Lily Tran wasn't here today. She looked back at Mason. Can I have a granola bar? Jacket. Emma looked at her unzipped jacket, zipped it, held out her hand. Mason produced a granola bar from his pocket, the same pocket it lived in every Saturday, because some routines had the structural integrity of load-bearing walls. And Emma took it and ran back toward her teammates without further ceremony. Mason watched her go. Isabella watched him watch her. You're good at this, she said. He snorted. Ask me again on a Tuesday when we've both had bad days and the homework isn't done and she won't eat anything I make. Still nothing. I'm getting through it. But his voice had something in it, not quite pride, something adjacent to it, the sound of a man who knew what he'd built even if he didn't call it building. She makes it possible to be good at it. Some kids are easy to show up for. She's one of those kids. She didn't get that from nowhere. He glanced at her sideways. That quick sideways look that she was starting to map. The one that meant he'd heard something he wasn't going to deflect but wasn't going to accept smoothly either. Don't, he said mildly. I'm not doing anything. You're being kind at me. I can tell the difference. She almost smiled. Being kind at you. There's a difference between saying something nice and meaning it and trying to make someone feel good about themselves. The first one's fine. The second one I don't need. I meant it. Okay. I did. I said okay, Isabella. But the corner of his mouth had moved just slightly, and she counted that. The second half started. They stood side by side on the sideline and watched, and the cold came down off the mountains in steady, even waves. And the coffee in Isabella's cup went from cold to genuinely pointless, and neither of them moved. Emma's team won 2 out of 3 games, which she declared a victory regardless of the math, and by 6 o'clock she had burned through every calorie she'd taken in and was listing slightly against Mason's shoulder in the back of the rental car Isabella had offered to drive because parking near the fields was easier with a smaller car. Mason had agreed to this with the particular expression of a man who has calculated that arguing about it costs more than conceding. They found a diner, not Patsy's Road Stop, but a similar organism, the kind of place that existed in every small Montana town like a civic necessity, and took a corner booth, Emma between them, her cleats still on because Mason had forgotten to put her spare shoes in the bag, and she'd pointed this out twice already with the satisfaction of someone who had been right about something. Emma ordered pancakes for dinner, because it was a tournament day, and on tournament days you could have pancakes for dinner, a rule she had apparently established at some point, and that Mason had not disputed enough to eliminate. Isabella ordered the same thing, which earned her a look of frank approval from Emma that Mason noticed and said nothing about. "Do you like soccer?" Emma asked Isabella in the tone of someone testing a hypothesis. "I played in schools," Isabella said. "Not well, but I played." "What position?" "Defense. I wasn't fast enough to be anywhere else." Emma thought about this. Defense is important. Dad says defense is what wins games, but everyone wants to score, so they always put the fast kids up front, and then the defense is just whatever's left. "That's accurate," Mason said, but unfair," Emma said firmly. "Also accurate." Emma nodded, resolved. She poured an aggressive amount of syrup on her pancakes and then looked at Isabella again. "Are you going to come to more games?" The table got very quiet for a second. Mason looked at his coffee. Isabella looked at Emma. The girl was watching her with those direct, uncomplicated eyes, asking a question she actually wanted answered, and had no interest in the social anxiety around the asking of it. "I'd like to," Isabella said. "If your dad says it's okay." Emma looked at Mason. "Is it okay?" Mason looked up from his coffee, looked at Emma, looked at Isabella for one measured moment, then back at Emma. "Sure," he said. "Good." Emma cut her pancakes. "You can stand next to Dad. He knows all the rules. He'll explain them." "I think I remember most of the rules." "He explains them anyway. He can't help it." "I don't explain the rules to everyone," Mason said, to no one in particular. "You explain them to Mrs. Hal Vorson, and she's been watching soccer for 40 years. She was confused about the offside call." She was not confused, she disagreed. Mason pointed his fork at her. "Don't be smart." "I learned it from you," Emma said, and ate her pancakes with complete serenity. Isabella looked at Mason over Emma's head. He was shaking his head slowly, but the thing she'd been watching for all day, the careful, self-maintained distance, the guarded quality he wore like a second layer of clothing, had loosened slightly over the course of the afternoon. It had been happening in small increments. The sideline, the car, the diner. Small increments of a man letting something down that he'd kept up for a long time. She didn't say anything about it. She just watched and was careful and ate her pancakes. Emma fell asleep on the drive back to the hotel, fully and completely, as was her nature. 1 minute talking about the corner kick she'd been practicing, and the next minute gone. Her cheek pressed against Mason's jacket sleeve, her breathing slow. Mason shifted his arm without thinking about it, making the angle better, and stared out the window at the dark road. Isabella drove. The heater ran. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but present somehow. You could feel them, the way you feel the mass of something even when you can't see it. "She asked me something last week," Mason said quietly, not to wake Emma. "She asked me if you were my girlfriend." Isabella kept her eyes on the road. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know what you were. She said that was a weird answer." He paused. "She's not wrong." "What did she say after that?" "She said that if I didn't know what you were, I should probably find out." His voice was dry. She watches too many movies. Claire's mother used to send her these romantic comedy DVDs. Very age inappropriate. I kept confiscating them. She kept finding them again. Isabella felt something move through her that she didn't try to name. She's not wrong about that either, she said carefully. Silence. No, Mason said. She's not. The town lights of Whitefish appeared ahead, amber and scattered through the trees. Neither of them spoke for the remaining 3 minutes it took to reach the hotel, and neither of them needed to. The quiet had a different quality than the quiet at the beginning. It wasn't distance anymore. It was the particular quiet of two people thinking about the same thing and being aware of each other thinking about it. She pulled into the hotel lot and cut the engine. Emma didn't stir. Mason looked at her, really looked, the way he'd been careful not to do directly until now. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be honest with you about that. I know how to work. I know how to raise Emma. I know how to get through a hard thing by just not stopping. He exhaled. I don't know how to start something. I forgot how to start something, or maybe I never really knew. Neither do I, she said. You run a company. That's completely different. Is it? In a company, I know the rules. I know what I'm protecting and what I'm risking and what the variables are. She looked at him. With you, I don't know any of that. I don't know what I'm allowed to want. I don't know what's reasonable after everything. She paused. I just know that I'm here, and I meant to be here. And that's more than I've been able to say about a lot of things. He was quiet a long time. Emma breathed between them, steady and oblivious, and her. Okay, he said. Okay? Yeah. He looked at his sleeping daughter. Okay, we figure it out. A beat. Slowly, one thing at a time. Slowly, Isabella agreed. He looked back at her. Something in his face had shifted. Not all the way, not dramatically, but the particular held-back quality had moved, like a door that hadn't opened yet but was no longer locked. I should get her in, he said. Of course. He got out of the car and came around to Emma's side and extracted her with the practiced ease of 100 previous extractions. One arm under her knees, one behind her back, her head dropping against his shoulder without waking. Isabella got out and held the car door and then walked beside him into the hotel lobby, and she pressed the elevator button when his hands were full, and they rode up in silence, and he carried Emma to the room and got her into the bed in the way he always did. Shoes off, blanket up, easy and careful. Isabella stood in his doorway. When he came back out and pulled the room door almost closed, he found her still there. He looked at her for a moment in the dim hallway light. Thank you for today, he said. Emma, she liked having you here. It means something, that she liked it. It meant something to me, too. He nodded. And then, in the particular way of someone who had decided to do something before thinking too long about it, he reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, a gesture so quiet and so quick that she almost wasn't sure it happened. Almost. Good night, Isabella, he said. She held still. Good night, Mason. He went back into the room. She walked down the hallway to her own. She sat on the bed for a long time with her coat still on. What followed December was January, which in Crestfall was a thing you survived rather than enjoyed. The cold settled in hard, and the snow on the mountain pass made the morning commutes complicated, and the garage was relentlessly busy with people who had not prepared their cars for winter and were paying for it now. Mason ran on 4 hours most nights and too much coffee and the knowledge that February was coming, which was always the small light at the end of the Montana winter tunnel. Isabella came back in January. Not for a weekend, for a week. She said she had a property acquisition she was looking at in Kalispell, which was true, but the meeting was Thursday and she arrived Monday and didn't leave until Sunday. Mason did not point out the math. Emma didn't notice the math. Gabe noticed the math, said nothing, and looked insufferably knowing about it. She stayed at the same hotel in Whitefish, which she had started to think of by the very dangerous word of familiar. She drove the mountain roads in the morning with coffee and the radio on, which she hadn't done in years, just driven, without a destination, without a call to take, watching the snow-loaded pines and the frozen creek beds and the way the morning light came through the timber at a low angle in winter and made everything look like it had been painted rather than photographed. She'd forgotten that there were parts of the world that looked like this. On Tuesday afternoon, she drove to Crestfall and parked outside Carter's mountain garage for the first time. It was smaller than she'd imagined, which made her realize she'd been imagining it. A two-bay building with a hand-painted sign, one bay door open to the cold, two vehicles inside and a pair of boots visible under one of them. The office window had a handwritten sign that said, "Back at 3" in red marker, and then underneath it, in different handwriting that was clearly Emma's, a drawing of what appeared to be a cat driving a car. She got out and stood by her car. The boots slid out from under the truck. Mason sat up and saw her and blinked once, like she was something he was verifying was real. There was grease on his forehead and on both hands, and he was wearing the Carhartt with the broken zipper. "You could have called," he said. "I was driving nearby." "Kalispell's 30 miles north." 31, she said. "I checked." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was getting better at reading. Not quite exasperated, not quite pleased, somewhere in the specific territory that was both at once. "I've got 40 minutes before the 3 o'clock, he said. "I know." "I read the sign." He got up, wiped his hands on a rag that made them slightly less greasy, and jerked his head toward the office. She followed him in. The office was small and warm from a space heater and had a desk covered in papers and two chairs and the smell of motor oil that had lived in the walls so long it had become the smell of the room. On the desk, beside a stack of invoices, there was a school photo of Emma in a magnetic frame, grinning the gap-toothed grin, her hair slightly askew, clearly having been told to smile and having decided to smile all the way. Isabella looked at it. "She hates having her picture taken," Mason said, coming around behind the desk to get to the coffee maker. "Thinks it's embarrassing, but she likes that one. Because she looks happy in it." She was happy in it. They had a substitute that day who let them watch a nature documentary about octopuses instead of doing math. He handed her a mug. "It might be bad coffee." "I'll survive." It was bad coffee. She drank it. They sat in the office and talked about the Kalispell property, which he had questions about that were unexpectedly specific, about the board situation, which had not fully resolved even after the vote, about a novel Emma was reading that she had declared too sad, but also I can't stop, which Mason said described her personality to a troubling degree. They talked the way they'd talked on the phone, easy and particular, except in person there was the coffee and the space heater and the school photo and the faint smell of engine grease. And Isabella sat in the vinyl chair across from his desk and felt, with a clarity that caught her slightly off guard, that she did not want to leave. Not the garage, not Crestfall, not this. She looked at Mason. He was looking at the invoice on his desk rather than at her, which she had also started to understand. He processed things by looking at other things, processing sideways rather than directly. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "What?" "Laurent International has a regional office in Missoula. It's understaffed and underperforming, and I've been putting off addressing it for 2 years because it required someone to actually be there to do it." He was still looking at the invoice. "Missoula is 100 miles from here." 94. Still not Crestfall. "No, but it's Montana." She looked at her coffee mug. I want to be clear that this is a business decision. I'm not telling you this because I think it changes anything between us or creates any kind of—" "Isabella." "What?" "You came 31 miles out of your way to tell me you're thinking about being in Montana more." She stopped. He looked up from the invoice. The expression on his face was the one that wasn't quite a smile, but had all the structural elements, the slight shift in the eyes, the controlled corner of his mouth. "You could have led with that," he said. "I'm being careful." "I noticed." "You told me to take it slowly." "I told me to take it slowly. I didn't know you were going to take it so literally that you'd drive past a perfectly good highway to come tell me a thing you could have texted." She felt warmth move up her neck. "I wanted to say it in person." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the way he nodded when he'd decided something. "Okay," he said. "Okay what?" "Okay, you should pursue the Missoula office. It sounds like a good business decision." He kept his voice level. "And if you happen to be in the area, you're welcome in Crestfall." She held his gaze. "I'll keep that in mind." "Good." He stood up. "The 3 o'clock is here." A truck had pulled into the lot. Mason picked up his rag and headed for the bay. She stood in the office for a moment, alone, and looked at Emma's school photo again. The gap-toothed grin, the happy eyes, the hair going slightly sideways. She finished the bad coffee and walked out to her car. The thing nobody tells you about building something careful and slow is that it doesn't feel like building at the time. It feels like just getting through days. It's only when you look back at a distance that you see the shape of what you were doing. By February, Isabella had been to Crest Falls 6 times. By February, she had a drawer at Patsy's road stop with her specific brand of tea in it, because Patsy had ordered it without being asked or thanked. By February, Emma had taught her 2 card games and a handshake that apparently had very specific correct steps, and she had failed the handshake 4 times and finally gotten it right on the 5th, which Emma had celebrated with the same intensity she brought to soccer goals. By February, she had stood in Mason's garage and handed him tools while he explained what he was doing in the specific technical way he explained things. Not performing, just telling, the way he talked about everything he understood well. And she had listened in the way she listened to things that mattered, completely, without looking at her phone. And by February, Mason had started doing something he noticed only after the fact. He had started leaving the kitchen light on when he knew she was coming. Not on purpose. Or not consciously on purpose. Just the light was on, and the coffee was made, and the back door was unlocked because she sometimes arrived after Emma was asleep, and knocking woke Emma, and Emma would then be awake for 2 more hours. He didn't think about it as a pattern until Gabe pointed it out, which Gabe did while eating a perfectly reasonable breakfast burrito from an actual restaurant this time, with the air of someone who had been patiently waiting to say something. "You leave the light on for her," Gabe said. Mason looked up from his work order. "What?" "The light. Emma told me. She woke up one night when Isabella was over and the kitchen light was on. Said it's always on now when Isabella's coming." Gabe looked at him over the burrito. "You leave the light on." "It's just a light." "No, it's not." Gabe. "Mason, it's not just a light, and you know it's not just a light, and I'm not going to make a whole thing about it. I just want you to hear yourself say that it's just a light, and know that you're wrong." Mason put down the work order, picked it up again. "She comes late sometimes, after Emma's asleep. It's easier if—" "I know why," Gabe said. That's the whole point. I know why and you know why, and the only person pretending not to know why is you. This is why I don't tell you things. You tell me everything. You just tell it sideways." Gabe finished the burrito. "She good to Emma?" "Yeah." "Emma like her?" "Emma adores her. It's slightly embarrassing." "And you?" "Don't. I'm going to." "Gabe, I swear. And you're leaving lights on and coming in early so the coffee's made, and Patsy told me you fixed Isabella's car last week when she brought it in for a noise and you didn't charge her." Mason stared at him. "Patsy told you that?" "Patsy tells me everything. She's bored. You live in a small town." Gabe looked at him steadily. "You're already there, you know. You're just not saying it yet." Mason said nothing for a long moment. The garage was quiet except for the hiss of the space heater and the distant sound of the road. "It's not that simple," he said finally. "I know it's not simple. She lives in San Francisco. She runs a company. Her life is—" He gestured inadequately. "It's not here." "Maybe, maybe not." Gabe stood up, crumpling the wrapper. "But you're leaving the light on, man. That means something. Least you can do is admit it means something." He walked back to his bay. Mason looked at the work order in his hands without reading it. He thought about February evenings, the kitchen light on, coffee made, the sound of her car on the gravel drive, Emma's voice down the hall, calling out even half asleep. "Isabella's here." As if it were ordinary. As if it were just how things were. He put the work order down. He went back to work. But Gabe was right, and they both knew it, which was the thing about Gabe. He didn't say things that weren't true. He was annoying precisely because he wasn't wrong. It happened on the last Saturday of February, the way the real things tend to happen, not in the orchestrated moments you've been watching for, but in the small and unremarkable ones that you weren't braced against. Emma was at a sleepover at her friend Jess's house. Mason had told Isabella this with no particular inflection on a Thursday call, just part of the week's logistics, and she had arrived Saturday afternoon with groceries because she'd asked what he needed, and he'd said he was out of coffee, and she had interpreted this very liberally. They cooked dinner together, which was an experience in the particular way that first times are. A lot of minor miscommunications about who was using which burner, a smoke alarm that went off briefly and was silenced by Mason waving a dish towel at it with the air of someone who had done this before, the pasta boiling over once while they were both looking at something else. It was not a smooth or romantic dinner preparation. It was two people in a small kitchen who didn't have a shared system yet and were figuring it out in real time, and it was fine. It was actually fine. They ate at the kitchen table with the overhead light on, and it was dark outside and the February cold pressed against the window glass. And Mason had found a bottle of wine someone had given him probably 2 years ago and opened it with the frank admission that he had no idea if it was good because he didn't really drink wine, and it was actually decent. "This is strange," Isabella said. Not badly, just observationally. "What is?" "Being here. With you. Like this." She turned her wine glass. "I've been to your house 6 times, but this is the first time it's been—" She paused. "Emma's not here." "I know." "It's different." "Yeah." He looked at her across the table. "It is." The kitchen was quiet. The heater ran. The wine was decent. "I'm scared," she said. It came out plain and unqualified, and she didn't walk it back, which was what she would have done 2 years ago. The Isabella of 2 years ago would have found a smoother way to say it or not said it at all. "Of what specifically?" he said. "Of wanting something this much." She looked at him directly. "I got very good at not wanting things I couldn't have, and now it turns out I could maybe have this, and I don't know what to do with wanting it this much." Mason looked at his hands, both of them on the table, around his wine glass. "I fixed a car once," he said. "Old one. Someone's grandfather's car, sitting in a barn for 15 years. Every mechanic they'd taken it to said it was gone. Not worth the labor." He looked up. "I spent 4 months on it, every night after the garage closed, parts I had to machine myself because you couldn't get them anymore." He paused. "People thought I was crazy. Gabe thought I was crazy. Emma thought it was cool, which tells you something about Emma." She was watching him, waiting. "When I finally got it running—" He stopped, seemed to be deciding how much to say. "I pulled out of the garage and drove it down Route 9, and I couldn't explain what that felt like. 4 months of believing something was possible when everyone else told me it wasn't." He looked at her. "I'm not comparing you to an old car." "I know. I'm saying He exhaled. "I'm saying I know what it feels like to be scared of how much you want something to work." He looked at her steadily. "I've been scared of this since the rain." The kitchen was very quiet. She reached across the table, her hand on the back of his. He looked at it, then turned his hand over and held hers. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Outside, the February wind moved through the pine trees with a long, low sound, and the kitchen light burned warm and even, the same light that had been on 6 times now, on purpose, or not on purpose, or both, and it held them there in its ordinary, uncomplicated glow. Spring came to Crestfall the way it always did, reluctantly, in stages, with several convincing false starts that fooled nobody who'd lived there longer than a year. March was still winter with ambitions. April was negotiation. The snow retreated up the mountain faces but didn't disappear, just pulled back to a respectful distance, and the mud came in to fill the space it left. Thick, red-brown mud that got into everything, and that the locals accepted with the philosophical resignation of people who had no alternative. The garage was busy in spring. Winter damage presenting itself. People emerging from the cold months with cars that had been sitting or neglected and now needed the accounting. Mason ran 2 bays at full capacity through March and into April, and Gabe complained about the pace while working twice as hard as he complained, which was how Gabe operated. The Missoula office was real. Isabella had made the decision in February, filed the paperwork in early March, and by the second week of April, she was dividing her time between San Francisco and Montana with a schedule that made Diane Park produce a color-coded calendar that she sent to Isabella with no comment, which was itself a comment. She had found an apartment in Missoula, rented, not bought, which she told herself was because it was a business arrangement and told herself that without fully believing it. And she drove the 94 miles to Crestfall on the weekends she was in Montana, which was most of them. This was not a small thing. She was aware it was not a small thing. Her board was also aware and made their awareness known through a series of carefully worded concerns about leadership visibility and executive presence that were polite enough to be professional and specific enough to be pointed. She handled them the same way she handled everything the board sent at her, directly, with data and without apology. The Missoula office, she told them, was a strategic priority. The numbers supported it. She had taken the company from $200 million in revenue to just under $1 billion in 6 years. Her physical location had never been the problem they were now pretending it was. Terrence Albrecht, who had not forgiven her for the vote in November, said in a meeting that he worried about her focus. She told him her focus was fine and asked if he had concerns about the Q1 projections, which were excellent, and he did not. She flew back to San Francisco that night and called Mason from the plane, which she wasn't supposed to do, but the Wi-Fi was working and she needed to hear a voice that wasn't trying to manage her. "Albrecht again?" he said when she described it, without her having to explain the context because she'd told him enough about Albrecht over the months that the name alone was sufficient. "He's building something. I can feel it, but I can't see the shape of it yet." "What do you think he wants?" "Control. He always wants control. The question is what he's willing to do to get it this time." She leaned her head back against the seat. The plane was mostly empty. Somewhere over Nevada, probably. He made a comment about the Montana arrangement, called it an unconventional geographic strategy. That's a polite way to say it. He's always polite. That's what makes him dangerous. She paused. "He knows about you." A beat. "Okay," Mason said. "Someone told him. I don't know who. He didn't say it directly. He never says anything directly. But he mentioned that personal entanglements could complicate executive decision-making, and I knew exactly what he meant." "Are you worried about that?" "I'm worried about a lot of things. That's not new." She looked out the small oval window at the dark below. No features. Just dark. "I'm not going to pretend it's not complicated. My company, my position, they're things I built, Mason. Not from nothing. I know that. I had the name and the foundation. But the company I run now is not the company my father left me. I made it something different. I won't just hand those things over because someone with a suit and a grievance decides my personal life is his business." "Breeze." "I know. I'm not asking you to fix this. You needed to say it out loud," he said. She stopped. "Yes." "Say it then. I'm here." So she talked for 20 minutes somewhere over the dark middle of the country, not looking for solutions, just saying the things she was carrying out loud to the one person who had never once asked her to be smaller or simpler than she was. And he listened, and occasionally asked a question that showed he'd been paying attention. And when she ran out of things to say, they just stayed on the line for a while in the particular quiet of two people who had gotten comfortable in each other's silence. "Get some sleep on the plane," he said eventually. "I will. Emma made something for you, a card. She decided you were having a hard week. I don't know how she knew. She just announced it at dinner. The card has a picture of a lion on it because she says lions are the bravest." Isabella pressed her fingers against her mouth for a second. Just a second. "Tell her thank you," she said, and her voice was steady. "I'll tell her." A pause. "She's not wrong. About the lion." Isabella said nothing, just held the phone. "Good night, Isabella." "Good night, Mason." She hung up, looked out the window. The dark below was starting to show the faint grid of city lights somewhere far ahead. She thought about a kitchen in Crestfall with the light on. Thought about a card with a lion on it, made by a kid who had decided she was having a hard week without being told. She fell asleep somewhere over California and didn't wake up until the wheels came down. The thing Albrecht had been building revealed itself in May. It was a proposal. A formal one, 22 pages, distributed to the full board 3 days before the scheduled quarterly meeting, which gave Isabella exactly 72 hours to read it, understand it, and prepare a response. The timing was not accidental. Nothing Terrence Albrecht did was accidental. The proposal outlined a new governance structure for Laurent International. More board oversight of operational decisions above a certain dollar threshold. A newly created executive committee, chaired as it happened by Albrecht himself, with approval authority over strategic partnerships, geographic expansions, and what the document called with breathtaking vagueness, material changes to leadership availability and focus. It was elegant. She would give him that. It was the most elegant dismantling of her authority she'd ever seen proposed on paper. She read it twice in her San Francisco office on a Tuesday morning with the door closed and Diane holding all her calls. Then she put it down on her desk and sat with her hands flat on either side of it and breathed. She called her attorney, a woman named Patricia Voss, who had been practicing corporate law for 30 years and who had the calm of someone who had seen everything and found most of it manageable. Patricia read it while Isabella waited. Then she said, "It's legal. It's also aggressive. He's calling in favors. Whoever drafted this knew your charter. What are my options? You have the votes to block it as written. Maybe. 4 board members are solid for you. 3 are solid for him. 3 are persuadable. This is going to come down to those 3 and what they want more, stability or change. What do the persuadables want? 2 of them want reassurance that the company is focused and the leadership is present. 1 of them wants a seat on the new executive committee if it passes, which tells you everything about his position." Patricia paused. "You need to talk to the first 2 before the meeting, not email. In person. I'll fly to New York tomorrow. I'd recommend tonight." She booked the flight while still on the phone with Patricia. Then she sat for a moment. Then she called Mason. He answered on the second ring. Background sounds. The garage, the particular metal and air compressor and ambiance she'd come to know well. "I need to tell you something," she said. The background sounds moved, shifted. He was walking somewhere quieter. "The office." She heard the door. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I mean, something is happening, but I can deal with it." She told him the short version. The proposal. The vote. The 72 hours. "I have to fly to New York tonight. I might not be in Montana this weekend." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay. I know we were—" "Isabella, go handle your company. That comes first. You're not—" "I'm not anything." His voice was even. "It's your company. You built it. Go protect it." A pause. Emma's going to complain. "Tell her I'll bring her something from New York. She's going to ask for a specific thing. Whatever she wants." Another pause, shorter. "Are you going to be okay?" The question was simple and direct and landed somewhere specific. "Yes," she said. "I'll be okay." "Then go. Call me when it's done." She hung up, stood up, and started figuring out what she was going to say to 2 board members who were standing between her and everything she'd built. New York was New York, loud and demanding and indifferent, which she had always found bracing rather than hostile. She met with the first board member, a woman named Grace Chen, who had joined the board 3 years ago and whose concerns were legitimate and deserved to be taken seriously over dinner at a restaurant they both knew. Grace was 61 and precise and not cruel, and she listened to Isabella with the full attention of someone who hadn't made up her mind yet. "My concern," Grace said over water, because Grace didn't drink at working dinners, "is sustainability. You're running a billion-dollar company. The Missoula arrangement, the weekends in Montana. I understand it's personal, and I have no interest in your personal life as a personal matter. What I have an interest in is whether the company has the leadership presence it needs." "The numbers say it does," Isabella said. "The last 2 quarters? Yes. And the 2 before that? And the 2 before that?" Isabella kept her voice level. "I have given this company 6 years of work that has tripled its value. I have never missed a critical meeting, never dropped a major decision, never left the company exposed when it needed me present. My being in Montana on weekends is not a threat to Laurent International's performance. Terrence Albrecht's proposal is a threat to Laurent International's performance because it introduces a governance layer that would slow decision-making by 3 to 4 weeks minimum on every significant move we make. And in our market, 3 to 4 weeks is the difference between leading and reacting. Grace looked at her for a long moment. "Is this serious?" she said. "Montana." Isabella didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Who is he?" "A good man, a hard-working man, a single father who has been through serious losses and built something real with what he had left." She paused. "He has never once asked me to make myself smaller. He doesn't need anything from me except what I actually want to give." Grace picked up her water glass, looked at it. "My husband was a school teacher," she said. Everyone told me it would be complicated, that it would be a distraction. She set the glass down. He was the least complicated thing in my life for 32 years. Isabella waited. I'll need to see Q2 projections before the meeting, Grace said. I'll have them on your desk by tomorrow noon. Then I think we can have a productive conversation about the proposal. It wasn't a yes, but it was the door. The second meeting was harder. The second board member, a man named David Park, no relation to Diane, was 64 and had been on the board since Isabella's father's time, and had the deep, specific skepticism of someone who had watched a lot of people overestimate themselves. He met her for breakfast the next morning and said almost nothing for the first 20 minutes, except to ask questions about the Missoula office's actual operational performance metrics, which she answered fully because the numbers were good and she'd brought the documentation. Then he said, Albrecht has been talking to 2 of your senior VPs. She looked at him. I'm not telling you whose side I'm on, he said. I'm telling you what I know. He's been having conversations about what Laurent International would look like with a different operational structure. Not just the board proposal. Deeper than that. How deep? Deep enough that you should be asking your VPs some direct questions before Thursday. She drove back to the hotel in a cab and stared out the window at the city going past, and thought about what David Park had just told her and what it meant, and what she was going to do about it. She thought about the 22-page proposal sitting on her desk in San Francisco. She thought about Terrence Albrecht's patient, persistent, penguins in suits ambition. She thought about 6 years of her life. She picked up her phone and called Diane. I need you to set up one-on-ones with the senior VP team, all of them, by end of tomorrow. All 6? All 6. And Diane, she paused, be discreet about the scheduling. Don't flag it as unusual. Understood. A pause. Are you okay? I'm working on it. She hung up and looked at her phone for a moment. She thought about calling Mason, decided against it, not because she didn't want to, but because she needed to stay in the problem right now. And Mason's voice had the specific and inconvenient effect of making her feel like things were manageable, which was not always useful when you needed to stay sharp on the edges. She called Patricia instead. The board meeting was on a Thursday. She went in with the Q2 projections, an independent governance analysis she'd commissioned in 48 hours from a firm with no existing relationship to Laurent International, and the results of 6 one-on-one conversations with her VP team, 5 of which had been reassuring, and 1 of which had been a senior VP named Charles Whitfield, who had been talking to Albrecht and who Isabella had listened to for 40 minutes before accepting his resignation quietly and agreeing on a transition arrangement that protected the company and was, all things considered, more generous than it needed to be. She had not slept much in 3 days. She sat at the head of the board table and looked at Albrecht across it and thought, not for the first time, that people who made their moves slowly and politely and with great attention to plausible deniability were in some ways the most dangerous kind. He looked back at her with the composed, patient expression of a man who believed he had already won. The meeting ran 3 hours. When it was over, the proposal had been tabled, not defeated. Tabled, which meant it wasn't gone, but it wasn't happening now, by a vote of 6-3. Grace Chen had voted with Isabella. David Park had voted with Isabella. Even one of Albrecht's presumed supporters had shifted, though he would never say why, and Isabella didn't ask. She collected her documents, said what needed to be said, walked out. In the elevator alone, she let herself lean against the wall for exactly the length of time it took to descend 12 floors. Then the doors opened, and she walked out. She drove back to Montana that weekend instead of flying, which Diane registered without comment by rescheduling Monday's first meeting to the afternoon. The drive was 16 hours, and Isabella did it in 2 days, stopping overnight in a small town in Idaho whose name she didn't look up, staying in a motel that had a vending machine and a bed and nothing else she needed. She drove with the radio on and then off, and then on again. She ate bad gas station food and drank too much coffee and called no one. She needed the drive. The specific, forward-moving, there is only the road quality of it. She had needed it in October when she'd pointed the Porsche north and ended up on a mountain highway in the rain, and she needed it now. Her head had been inside strategy and contingency and institutional maneuvering for 5 days, and she needed the thing that came from just going somewhere. She crossed into Montana on a Sunday afternoon when the light was doing the thing it did in spring, low and gold and specific, catching the tops of the mountains and leaving the valleys in soft shadow. She pulled over once to look at it properly, stood beside the car on the gravel shoulder with the wind off the ridge in her face and the smell of pine and thawed earth and cold water somewhere nearby. She thought, this is real. Everything else is also real and important and hers, but this is real. She got back in the car and drove the rest of the way to Crestfall. Mason was in the garage when she pulled in, which she could tell from the open bay door and the legs visible under the truck. She sat in the car for a second, not because she was uncertain. She was past uncertain. She had crossed out of uncertain somewhere in Idaho, but because she wanted to look at it for a moment. The hand-painted sign. Emma's cat driving a car drawing in the window, replaced now with a new one that appeared to be a dinosaur in what might have been a go-kart. The ordinary, useful, real shape of this place. She got out of the car. The legs slid out from under the truck. Mason sat up. He'd been expecting her today. She'd texted from the road, but she was earlier than she'd said, and she could see him recalibrate, a brief flicker of surprise before his face settled. You drove. I drove. He got up, wiped his hands, looked at her in the specific way he had, taking account, checking that something was actually okay, rather than just being told it was. How'd it go? He said. I still have my company. Good. It was close. I figured. She stood there in the gravel lot with the afternoon light on her. She was tired in a way that went past physical. A deeper, cleared-out kind of tired that comes after something you've been braced against is over. I'm tired, Mason, she said. Not as complaint, just as fact. I know. He looked at her. Emma's at soccer practice till 5. Come inside. She followed him into the office. The space heater. The invoice piles. Emma's photo on the desk. A new one from the spring tournament. Same grin. Hair slightly better. The smell that was the smell of the room. He made coffee. She sat in the vinyl chair. I made a decision, she said, while he was at the coffee maker. What kind? The kind that's going to be complicated to execute and is probably going to worry Diane and give Albrecht something to work with. She paused. I'm going to restructure my role at Laurent International. Not because of the board. I want to be clear. It's not because of the board. It's because I've spent 6 years doing a job that required me to be available to it every hour of every day. And I've done it, and I'm going to do it differently now. He turned around and looked at her. I want a COO who can carry the day-to-day operational weight. I want to step back to strategic and visionary functions. I want to be able to be in Montana 4 days a week without it being a governance crisis every quarter. She looked at him levelly. I want to be here, Mason. That's what I'm trying to say without making it into something you feel pressured by. He was quiet for a long moment. That's a big decision, he said. Yes. You're not making it because of... I'm making it because of a lot of things. And you're one of them, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but it's not only you, and it's not a sacrifice. She kept her voice steady. I'm not 20 years old. I don't make decisions the way I did when I was 20. This is something I'm choosing with my eyes open. He looked at her. The coffee maker beeped behind him. Okay, he said. Okay, it's a big decision, or okay, you heard me. Both. He turned and poured 2 mugs, set one in front of her. You want to meet the people who would actually need to run the day-to-day? Before you decide on a COO. She blinked. You mean your opinion on who should run Laurent International's operations? I mean, he sat down across from her. I mean, you talk about your team. I've heard about all of them. You know who you trust. Sometimes saying it to someone else out loud tells you who it is before you've consciously decided. She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. Not a polished laugh, a real one, slightly surprised, the kind that came out before you decided to have it. You're going to help me pick my COO. I'm going to listen while you figure out who you already know it is. She picked up the coffee mug. The bad coffee that she had learned to actually like because it was this coffee in this room. Diane, she said. Your assistant? She's not just my assistant. She's been doing half the COO job for 2 years and pretending she wasn't because the title was never offered. Isabella turned the mug in her hands. She knows every operation, every relationship, every problem before I do. She's better at the day-to-day management than I am, and she'll tell me when I'm wrong, which is non-negotiable. She paused. The board will push back. She's younger than they'd want. But she's who you trust. She's who I trust. Then she's who it is. Isabella looked at him across the small desk, in the warm, oil-smelling office, with the afternoon light coming through the window and Emma's drawings on the glass and the mountains outside going gold. "How do you do that?" she said. "Do what?" "Make it simple. Not simple like it's easy, well, simple like it's clear. I've been running around this for weeks and you asked one question." He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way he did when something was aimed directly at him. "I didn't do anything. You knew." "I knew, but I needed—" She stopped. "Someone to say it to," he said. "Yes." He nodded, drank his coffee. Outside, a car pulled in. Not Emma. The soccer carpool was always the same blue minivan, and this was something heavier. A customer. Mason stood up. "I've got to get back to it," he said. "Of course." He went to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, turned back and looked at her. The full, direct look that he mostly kept in reserve, the one without the protective layer of sideways. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you're here. Not as a fact about a decision, just, I'm glad you drove." She held that for a moment. "Me too," she said. He went back to the bay. She stayed in the office with the coffee and the heater and Emma's drawings on the window glass, and the kind of quiet that doesn't require filling. At 4:50, a blue minivan pulled into the lot, and Emma came out of it like a controlled explosion of shin guards and opinions and immediately opened the office door and said, "You're here early," with the tone of someone satisfied to be right about something, and Isabella said, "I drove," and Emma said, "Good. I got a card for you. It's about the lion, but Dad probably already told you." And Isabella said he had, and Emma said, "Does it help?" And Isabella said, "It actually did." And Emma considered this with her scientist seriousness and said, "Good. Lions are the bravest. I thought about a bear, but bears sleep all winter, and that didn't seem like you." And Isabella looked at this small, forthright, entirely specific person and felt something settle in her chest. Not dramatically, not like a revelation, just like something finding the place it was supposed to be and staying there. "Come on," Emma said. "Dad makes dinner at 6, but I can show you my new corner kick in the backyard before it gets dark." She followed Emma out of the office into the spring afternoon, into the clean, cold air and the long light and the sound of Mason in the bay behind them. And the yard was muddy from the thaw, and Emma's corner kick needed work, but she had the right instinct, and Isabella stood in the backyard of a small house in a mountain town and watched an 8-year-old practice soccer in the last light, and she was tired still, and it had been a brutal week, and none of that went away. But there was this too. And this, she was starting to understand, was not small. Summer came to Crestfall without negotiation. One morning in early June, the last of the snow was gone from the lower ridges, and the creek behind the elementary school ran fast and clear with snowmelt, and the air had that particular quality it got in early Montana summer, clean and slightly electric, like the world had been rinsed. Emma declared it officially warm enough to eat outside and began campaigning for a backyard dinner with the focused persistence she applied to all campaigns she believed in. Mason said he'd think about it. She took this as a yes and started planning the menu, which was her standard operating procedure. Life had developed a shape that none of them had drawn deliberately, but that had become, over the course of 8 months, undeniably real. Isabella was in Montana 4 days most weeks, sometimes 5, occasionally 3 when San Francisco required it, never fewer if she could manage it. The Missoula office had turned a corner under the operational focus she'd brought to it, and Diane Park, now officially COO of Laurent International, had taken to the role with the thoroughness of someone who had been quietly doing the job for years and simply hadn't been handed the title. The board had pushed back on the appointment exactly as Isabella had predicted, and she had handled it exactly as she'd planned, and by the end of the first quarter under the new structure, the numbers had made the argument she couldn't make with words alone. Terrence Albrecht had resigned from the board in April. He'd sent a letter citing personal reasons, which was the corporate language for "I didn't win, and I'm not staying to watch." Isabella had read the letter twice, filed it, and not thought about him again with anything approaching significant energy. She had spent too much of the last year thinking about Terrence Albrecht. The resignation was, among other things, a return of time. On the Friday afternoon that Mason came home from the garage to find Isabella and Emma in the backyard, Emma demonstrating a corner kick technique for an audience of one who was paying genuine attention and occasionally asking questions that suggested she'd been studying the sport on her own. He stood in the back doorway for a moment without announcing himself. He did this sometimes, just looked. He wasn't sure exactly when the house had started feeling different. Not loud about it, just inhabited in a way it hadn't been. There was a good coffee maker on the counter now because Isabella had replaced the old one without fanfare, and he had pretended to object for about 4 minutes before accepting that the coffee was significantly better. There were 2 different kinds of tea in the cabinet. Emma's drawings on the refrigerator had been joined, at Emma's insistence, by a printed photograph from the Whitefish tournament, Mason on the left, Isabella on the right, Emma in the middle with her arms thrown wide like she was trying to contain the entire frame, which she mostly did. He stood in the doorway and watched his daughter run through the kick again, listened to Isabella's feedback, specific, considered, clearly researched, and felt something that he had no tidy name for. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. Something more structural than that. Something that felt like the world being arranged correctly. Which was not how he'd expected to feel about anything ever again after Claire died. He was aware that was a significant thing to feel. He was also aware that he hadn't said it to anyone, including Isabella. He'd been working up to it in the particular way he worked up to most significant things, slowly, from the outside in, testing each piece of it before committing to the whole. Emma spotted him first, the way she spotted everything first. "Dad, come watch. I'm working on the approach angle." "I can see that," he said, walking down the back steps into the yard. "Your left foot's still dropping before contact." That's what Isabella said. Then listen to Isabella. Emma looked slightly put out at this unified front, but reset her position and tried again. The kick was better. She knew it was better. He could tell from the way she turned around, and she looked at both of them for confirmation. "Yes," Mason said. "Much better," Isabella said. Emma pumped her fist once, then immediately said, "I want to do it 20 more times," which was how she approached every correct thing she'd ever done, immediately trying to repeat it until it was permanent. Mason came to stand beside Isabella at the edge of the yard. She was wearing jeans and an old flannel he was fairly certain had started out as his, though the migration of this particular piece of clothing had happened gradually enough that its ownership was now genuinely ambiguous. She had her arms crossed against the early evening cool and was watching Emma with the kind of attention she brought to things she actually cared about. "Good day?" he asked. "Productive one. Long call with Diane, then a vendor negotiation that took 2 hours and should have taken 40 minutes, then I drove up early." She glanced at him sideways. "Emma called me at 3:30 to ask if I was coming for dinner. She'd already decided the menu." "She does that." "She told me she'd chosen pasta because you need carbohydrates before athletic training." "She's planning to practice after dinner?" "Until dark, apparently." Isabella watched Emma line up for another kick. "She asked me something today." "What?" Isabella was quiet for a moment. Emma's kick connected cleanly, and she spun around with both arms out, and Mason called it good without taking his eyes off Isabella. "She asked me if I was going to live here," Isabella said. The yard was quiet except for Emma resetting for another approach. "What did you tell her?" Mason said. "I told her I wasn't sure yet, that it was something I was thinking about." She paused. She said okay, and then asked if she could have the big guest room as her art room if I moved into the main one, and I said that was a separate conversation. Mason looked at his boots, then at Emma, then at the mountains above the tree line going orange in the early evening light. "She's been thinking about it for a while," he said. "I know. I have too." Isabella turned to look at him. "I haven't said it the way I should," he said. I work up to things. You know that. I work up to them from the outside and I take longer than most people." He looked at her directly. "But I want you here. Not as a weekend thing, not as a Montana when it's convenient thing. I want you here when you're here, and I want to know when you're coming home." He paused on the word, registered it, left it where it landed. "That's what I want. I don't know how we make it work practically. I know your life is bigger and more complicated than Crestfall, but that's what I want." Isabella looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. Emma kicked the ball again. It sailed clean and true, and she whooped at it. I want that too, Isabella said. I've wanted it for months. I've been careful about saying it because I didn't want to push. Yes. I know. He turned to face her fully. You weren't pushing. I just needed to get there. You got there in your own time. It's the only way I know how. She looked at him with something that had no complicated name, just the plain, direct look of a person who had been waiting to hear something and had heard it and was letting it settle in properly. Her eyes were bright in the evening light, and she wasn't trying to smooth her face into anything composed, which he noticed because she sometimes did that, the executive reflex, the careful management of what showed. It wasn't there now. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Emma, who had been practicing with the complete absorption of a child who was not listening to any adult conversation whatsoever, chose this moment to announce, the pasta needs to start in 20 minutes, or it'll be too late and I'll be hungry and sad. Then go start the water, Mason said. I'm 9. I'm not supposed to do the stove. You've been doing the stove since you were 7, and we both know it. Emma considered the ethics of this admission, decided it was fine, and went inside. Mason and Isabella stood in the backyard in the quiet that came after her. She's going to be insufferable about this, he said. She's going to be delighted, Isabella said. Same thing. Isabella laughed. The real one. The unguarded one he'd been collecting since October like something worth keeping. He'd gotten a lot of them over the months, and he still noticed every one. He reached out and took her hand, which was something he did now without deciding to, the same way he'd started leaving the kitchen light on. Not because he planned it, but because it was simply what he did, and what you do without thinking is usually the truest thing about you. She held on. Come on, he said. She'll actually start the pasta and burn the pot. She won't burn the pot. She's burned the pot twice. I know, she told me. Isabella let him pull her toward the back steps. She described it both times in great detail. They went inside. Boom. The conversation with Claire happened the way those conversations happened for Mason. At night, when Emma was asleep and the house was quiet and his brain finally had room to go where it needed to go. He didn't talk to Claire out loud. He never had. Not after the first few months when he'd been raw enough to try it and it had felt wrong, like a bad connection. What he did instead was sit somewhere quiet and think, and it was more like remembering than talking, but remembering with the specific quality of someone who was also being listened to. He sat on the back porch on a Tuesday night in late June. The sky was enormous above the mountains, the deep blue-black of late Montana night, with more stars than any sky he'd lived under before Montana had given him. Emma was asleep. Isabella was in Missoula, a 2-day run of meetings before she came back Thursday. He sat with a beer going warm in his hand and thought about Claire. He thought about the way she would have handled all of this. He wasn't asking permission. He'd worked that out in himself over months, the particular guilt of moving forward that sits on widowers like an unfair tax. He'd been to the grief counselor his doctor had pushed him toward 18 months after Claire died, a quiet man named Dr. Holloway, who had said something that had stuck. She loved you. Loving someone fully means wanting their life to keep going. Mason hadn't fully believed it the day Holloway said it. He believed it now. What he was doing on the back porch was simpler than asking permission. He was just telling her, the way you'd tell a person you loved about something significant, not because they could respond, but because they deserved to know. She's good to Emma. That was the thing that mattered most, and he knew Claire would have cared most about that, because Claire had been fierce about Emma in the particular way of mothers who knew they were running out of time. She's actually good to her. Not performing good, actually good. Emma loves her. You'd be able to tell the difference if you saw it, and it's real. He thought about the photograph on the refrigerator. Emma with her arms thrown wide. She makes the house feel like the house is supposed to feel. He didn't know a better way to say it than that. He sat with it for a while. The beer got fully warm and he stopped pretending he was going to drink it and set it on the porch railing. He thought about the thing he hadn't told anyone yet, the thing he'd been working toward from the outside in, the way he worked toward all significant things, testing each piece before committing to the whole. He'd bought a ring in May. He hadn't told Emma. He hadn't told Gabe, which was an act of significant willpower given that Gabe had an opinion about everything and would definitely have an opinion about this. He hadn't told Isabella, obviously. He'd bought it from the jeweler in Whitefish who'd done Claire's ring 12 years ago, a woman named Margaret, who had said nothing and asked no questions and had understood completely, with the particular grace of someone who had been in the business of significant moments long enough to know when to just do the work. It was a simple ring, not small. Isabella had earned something real. But not elaborate either, because Isabella already had elaborate, already had impressive, already could buy herself any ring in any case in any city in the country if what she wanted was impressive. What Mason thought she wanted, what he believed she wanted from him, was the thing she'd told him in a diner in the rain, and again with her hand over his on a kitchen table, and in 100 small ways across 8 months. Something true. So it was a simple ring. A diamond solitaire in a plain platinum band, clean and honest, the kind that just sat there and said what it was. He'd been waiting for the right moment, which he was beginning to understand was not a thing that announced itself ahead of time. He sat on the porch a little longer. The stars were doing what they did. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but there in the way they always were. The house behind him was warm and full of the specific quiet of a sleeping child, which he had come to understand was one of the most reassuring sounds in the world. Okay, he thought. Not to Claire exactly. To himself, maybe. To whatever part of him had been holding back. Okay, I've got this. He picked up the warm beer, walked inside, poured it down the drain, went to bed. He planned to do it in July. He'd had a vague notion about a particular trail above Crestfall that he'd hiked with Emma a dozen times, a place where the mountain opened up and you could see 4 separate ranges on a clear day, the kind of view that felt like the world showing you what it could do when it was trying. What actually happened was a Saturday morning in the second week of July when Emma had a sleepover at Jess's house and Isabella had made pancakes. She'd learned to make pancakes specifically, one of 3 things she'd taught herself to cook since January, the others being the pasta Emma liked, and a chicken dish she'd adapted from something her mother used to make. And they were sitting at the kitchen table in the morning quiet with coffee and the back door open to the summer yard. It was not a particularly remarkable morning. That was actually the thing about it. It was just a Saturday. The coffee was good. The pancakes were slightly overdone on the edges the way they always were because Isabella ran the heat too high and hadn't fully fixed this tendency despite knowing about it. The yard was green and the mountains were visible and Emma's soccer ball was sitting in the middle of the lawn where she'd left it, which was where it always was. Isabella was reading something on her tablet, a report probably. She always had a report. With her feet tucked under her in the chair the way she sat when she was comfortable and not thinking about how she looked. And her hair was down and she was wearing an old t-shirt and she had a small frown of concentration that she got when she was reading something with numbers in it. Mason looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and went to the bedroom and got the ring from the top shelf of his closet where it had been sitting in its box for 6 weeks. And he came back to the kitchen and stood there with it in his hand. She hadn't looked up yet. He sat back down across from her. Isabella. Still reading. Look at me for a second. She looked up, the frown still fading, and saw what was in his hand on the table between them. She went very still. He opened the box. I'm not good at speeches, he said. You know that about me by now. I don't have a speech. He looked at the ring, then at her. I know what my life was before October. I know what I was running on, and I know what I'd cut myself off from because cutting yourself off is easier than hoping for things that might not happen. He paused. You came back into my life in the rain on a highway, and I almost didn't stop, and I think about that sometimes. How close it was to not happening. He looked at her directly. I'm glad I stopped. I'm glad you told me the truth in the diner. I'm glad you called and came back and learned to make the pancakes even though you still run the heat too high. Her breath came out in something between a laugh and something that wasn't a laugh. And I'm glad Emma loves you because Emma doesn't pretend about anything. And if she loves you, it's real. He swallowed. I want to marry you. That's the speech. I want to marry you, and I want you to live here, and I want to figure out the rest of it as it comes, which it will, because nothing is simple, but I'd rather figure it out with you than have it be simple alone. Isabella looked at the ring, then at him. Her face was doing something he had never seen it do in 8 months of watching it, completely open, no management, no executive composure, just her, just the thing she actually felt, unedited. Her eyes were wet, which he had also never seen. Mason, she said. Yeah. You said you weren't good at speeches. I'm not. That was... She stopped, pressed her lips together. That was a very good speech. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation. She laughed, and it came out rough and real, and she reached across the table and took his face in both hands and looked at him for a long moment. And he let her look. Because he had nothing to hide from her anymore. And she had nothing to hide from him. And 10 years of wrong roads and hard losses and careful rebuilding were all right there between them and also completely behind them. Yes, she said. Yeah? Yes. Obviously, yes. She let out a breath. Yes. He took the ring out of the box. Her hand was not entirely steady when she held it out, and his wasn't either, which felt right. If you weren't shaking slightly when something this real was happening, you probably weren't paying attention. The ring fit. Of course it fit. He'd gotten her size from Diane, who had provided it without a single question, and had then sent him a text 20 minutes later that said only, "It's about time," which he had chosen to interpret as supportive. Isabella looked at her hand, then at him, then laughed again, softer this time, and he got up and came around the table, and she stood up, and he held her there in the kitchen with the back door open and the summer morning coming in and Emma's soccer ball in the yard and the mountains and the clear air beyond. They stood there for a while. The pancakes were cold. Neither of them noticed. Emma came home from the sleepover at 10:30 with her bag over one shoulder and mud on her shoes from somewhere, and the first thing she did was look at Isabella's hand, which was sitting on the kitchen table wrapped around a coffee mug, and go completely still in the doorway. Then she looked at Mason, then back at the hand. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, Bug." "Is that—" "Yeah." Emma dropped her bag on the floor, which she knew she wasn't supposed to do and did anyway, and crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and threw both arms around Isabella's neck from behind, nearly knocking the coffee mug out of her hand, and pressed her face into Isabella's shoulder. Isabella caught the mug. Put it down. Put both arms around Emma. Emma didn't say anything. She just held on, which was so unlike her, but Emma, who always had something to say, Emma, who narrated her way through every experience, that Mason stood and watched and understood this was the thing she hadn't had words for either. After a moment, Emma lifted her head. Her eyes were wet, but she looked fierce about it, the way she looked fierce about things she didn't want to be embarrassed by. "I'm not crying," she told Isabella. "I know," Isabella said. I'm glad." Emma wiped her face with the back of her hand, a gesture that was purely her father's. "I'm really glad." "Me too," Isabella said. "Me too, sweetheart." Emma looked at Mason over Isabella's shoulder. He raised his eyebrows slightly. The familiar shorthand they'd developed over 9 years of being the only 2 people in this house, the language of it, the small signals. Emma rolled her eyes, which was her way of acknowledging that he'd done something right, and then detached herself from Isabella and picked up her bag from the floor and said, "Can we do something today? All 3 of us?" With the energy of someone who had just had a significant feeling and was ready to put it somewhere. "Whatever you want," Mason said. "The trail, the one above town where you can see all the mountains." He looked at Isabella. She looked at him. He'd been planning to take her there in July for a different reason, but the reason had found its own morning, and the trail was still the trail. "Sure," he said. "I need to change my shoes," Emma said, and disappeared down the hall. Isabella looked at her hand again. The ring in the morning light. Then at Mason, and there was something in her face he recognized from the diner on Route 9. The same look she'd had when she'd said, "I never stopped loving you." Except different now. Settled, like something that had been traveling a very long way and had finally arrived. "You knew she'd react like that," Isabella said. "I had a theory. You could have told me. Then it wouldn't have been real." He looked at the hallway where Emma had gone. Nothing she does is performance. She either feels it or she doesn't. When she feels it, it's... He paused. "It's the most honest thing I know." Isabella nodded. She understood that. After 8 months of Emma's unfiltered, unperformable honesty, she understood it completely. Why, the trail took an hour up and was steep in the first quarter mile. The kind of steep that makes you reconsider your choices before it opens up and you understand why you came. Emma went first because she always went first, setting a pace that was slightly too fast and moderating it when Mason called her back without breaking stride, which was how their hikes had always gone. Isabella was in the middle. Mason was behind, where he could see both of them. He thought about what Gabe had said in February. "You're already there, you know. You're just not saying it yet." Gabe would be insufferable about this. Mason had already accepted that and moved through it. At the top of the ridge, the view opened up the way it always did. 4 ranges visible in the clear summer air, the peaks still carrying snow on their highest faces even in July, the valleys below green and long and threaded with silver where the creeks ran. Emma went to the flat rock at the edge that she always went to and stood on it with her arms out, which was what she always did, as if she needed to claim the whole thing physically. Isabella stood beside Mason and looked at it. "This is what you wanted to show me," she said. "Yeah. You've been here with her before many times. Every summer, started when she was 4. I carried her on my back the first time." Isabella was quiet, looking at the mountains and the light, and Emma on her rock with her arms out. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I should have said it more clearly before now." "What?" She turned to look at him. "I'm sorry. For what I did when we were 20. I know I said it in the diner, and I know we've moved through it. And we have moved through it, I know that. But I don't think I've said it simply enough." She held his gaze. "I made a decision that hurt you badly. I know the reasons, and you know the reasons. And I believe they were the only decision I could have made given what I was facing. But none of that changes that you spent years not knowing the truth. That wasn't fair, I'm sorry." Mo. He looked at her for a long moment. He had carried that hurt for a long time. He wasn't going to pretend he hadn't, or that it had simply dissolved because the explanation was good. It had taken months of patient, incremental trust building to get it down to a manageable size, and the truth was, it lived in him still in some small way, probably always would. The way a broken bone heals and holds but leaves something in the X-ray. What he had come to understand, somewhere in the middle of all those late-night phone calls and bad coffee and backyard soccer, was that carrying it didn't mean anything had to be decided by it. "I know," he said. "I believe you. I need you to know I would never—" She stopped. "I'm not 20. I don't have anyone left who has power over my choices the way my father did. I know you've never said this was a concern, but I think about it. What I walked away from when I was 20. I would never choose that again. I know that too." "Okay." She exhaled. "Okay." I just needed to say it without diner acoustics and a sleeping child nearby. He almost smiled. Better conditions. Significantly. He reached out and took her hand, the left one, where the ring was. Held it. "I'm not 20 either," he said. "I know what I'm doing. I'm not someone who asks a question he hasn't thought about." He looked at the mountains. Claire was real. What we had was real, and I don't want to clean that up or make it easier for anyone, including you. She was Emma's mother, and she was mine for 8 years, and that's always going to be true. He looked back at Isabella. "And you're also real, and this is also real. I don't need it to be simple to know it's true." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not needing it to be simple." She looked at him. Not many people can hold more than one true thing at a time. Emma, from her rock, announced that she could see a hawk. "Where?" Mason called. "Northwest, over the second ridge." He looked. There was, in fact, a hawk. "Nice spot," he said. Emma looked back at them with the direct gaze she'd had since she was born, taking in their joined hands, the ring in the light, the particular way 2 people stand when something has shifted between them. "Are you guys doing something?" she said, meaning, he understood, "Are you having a moment?" "We're looking at the hawk," Mason said. "No, you're not." But she turned back to the hawk, giving them the privacy of a 9-year-old who has decided something is fine and is willing to allow it. The fall came, and with it came the ordinary weight of real life, which does not take a season off for happiness. There was the question of the house, which needed more room than it had been designed for, and the contractor who came in September and spent 2 hours walking through it and produced a plan that was more expensive than Mason had expected and less expensive than Isabella had expected, which they took as a sign they were probably in the right range. Emma lobbied hard for a larger bedroom and received, in exchange for agreeing to the smaller of two possible rooms, a proper art space in what had been a storage room off the hallway, which she immediately filled with materials and declared the best room in the house. There was the question of Mason's role in Isabella's life outside of Crestfall, whether he was a private matter or a present one, whether she introduced him to people and how and when. This one they talked about for a long time, at the kitchen table and on the phone and on a walk through Crestfall on a Sunday in October with Emma ahead of them on her bike. Mason had opinions about this, and they were specific. He didn't want to be managed. He wasn't interested in being kept tidy in a compartment that fit more cleanly into her professional life. If they were doing this, they were doing it. She'd agreed without hesitation. She'd taken him to San Francisco in October to a dinner that included 2 board members and a long-standing business partner, and she had introduced him plainly, Mason Carter, my fiancé, he owns a garage in Crestfall, and watched the room recalibrate and not offered them any further assistance in doing so. Mason had shaken hands and talked to people and asked a board member about his car trouble with the same directness he brought to everything. And by the end of the dinner, the same board member had his number and a promise that Mason would take a look at the problem next time he was in San Francisco. Isabella had found this deeply satisfying. There was the question of Emma and school and what 5th grade looked like in Crestfall versus what it might look like elsewhere. A conversation that Emma participated in directly because Mason had raised her to participate in decisions that concerned her directly. Emma's position was stated once and clearly. She liked her school, she liked Jess, she liked Crestfall, and she did not wish to move. This was taken as settled, because Emma's position on things that mattered to her was generally immovable once stated, and because they had no intention of moving her. There was the question of Mason at Isabella's company, whether he had a view, whether she wanted him to have a view, whether his mechanical logic translated in a world of quarterly projections and stakeholder management. The answer turned out to be that it translated better than either of them had expected, in the specific way of people who think clearly about systems regardless of what kind. He didn't go to board meetings. He did sit at the kitchen table sometimes while she worked through problems out loud, and the questions he asked, simple, structural, cutting to what actually mattered, had become something she relied on in a way she'd told Diane about, and that Diane had found, in her particular way, completely unsurprising. There was, in November, a quiet ceremony at the Whitefish Courthouse with Gabe as witness, and Patsy Kowalski and her husband and Emma in a dress she had chosen herself and approved with the gravity of a military inspector. It was not a large wedding. Isabella had offered one, and Mason had said he didn't need a large wedding, and she had said honestly, "Neither do I," and that had been the end of it. Diane had cried at the photos, which she denied. Gabe had cried at the ceremony, which he also denied, though the evidence was on his face. Patsy had made the cake, which was an apple cake because Mason always had the apple pie, and she'd adapted it, and she presented it at the dinner afterward at the road stop, closed for the evening, all 4 tables pushed together, with the air of someone doing something completely ordinary that they also happened to have put significant effort into. Emma gave a toast that she had written and memorized and delivered with the focused seriousness of someone who had practiced it, and it was 3 minutes long, and it talked about the night her dad stopped on the highway in the rain, and about lions, and about the kitchen light being on, and by the end of it, every adult in the room had something going on with their face. Mason held it together until the very last line, when Emma said, looking at Isabella, "I used to ask Dad sometimes why we didn't have people who stayed. Now we do. So I don't have to ask anymore." He did not entirely hold it together after that. Nobody mentioned it. That was what people who cared about each other did. They witnessed the real things, and then they moved on with grace. On the first snowy night of December, Mason came home from the garage late. It had been a long day. 2 jobs backed up from a parts delay, a customer with unreasonable expectations about the timeline, the particular fatigue of work that had been mostly good but gone on too long. He came through the front door at 8:15 and stopped. Emma was asleep on the couch by the fireplace, a book open on her chest the way books always ended up when she fell asleep reading, her soccer socks still on and her hair spread out on the cushion. The fire had burned down to coals. The room had the warm, amber quality of a house that had been lived in, really lived in, for the evening. Isabella was in the kitchen, He could hear her moving to the quiet sound of the refrigerator, something being set on the counter. She appeared in the doorway between the rooms when she heard him come in, and she looked at him across the living room. "Long day?" she said. "Parts delay," he said. "2 jobs behind. I'll explain the whole thing and it'll take longer than it's worth." "Okay," she looked at Emma. "She fell asleep around 7:30. I figured I'd let her stay until you got home." He looked at his daughter on the couch, at the book on her chest. He looked at Isabella. He thought about a highway in October rain. He thought about almost keeping driving. He thought about everything that had been in the dark of the years between, the grief and the good and the hard and the love. All of it, every part of it. And he thought about the fact that a person's life was mostly the accumulation of ordinary moments that didn't know they were significant while they were happening. This was an ordinary moment. He was tired. Emma was asleep. His wife was standing in the kitchen doorway. He would remember it. He already knew he would remember it. "You eat?" Isabella asked. "Not really. There's pasta." She disappeared back into the kitchen. "Sit down. I'll heat it up." He took off his jacket and hung it up, went to the couch and picked up Emma's book from her chest and set it on the coffee table. Emma stirred, made a small sound, went still. He looked at the fire. He thought about something his uncle had told him once, the man who'd first put a wrench in his hand, who had died the year Emma was born and never got to meet her. "The best work you'll ever do," his uncle had said, not about cars, just about work in general, about life, about the whole project of it, is the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just holds. The pasta smell came from the kitchen. The fire glowed. The snow came down outside the window in the quiet, particular way of first December snow, without hurry. He went to the kitchen. Isabella handed him a bowl. He sat at the table. She sat across from him with her tea, and the overhead light was warm, and outside the snow kept falling, and neither of them needed to say anything because everything that needed saying had already been said, and what was left was just this: the two of them, in a kitchen, in a house that held, on a winter night at the beginning of whatever came next. Which was not nothing. Which was, in the end, everything.